Now that's a real martial art. But have you ever wondered what the fakest martial art is? The deadliest one. The most effective one. Well, I present to you the martial arts and fake martial arts styles iceberg, an expansive list of every single style of martial art that you can imagine. And as we go down this iceberg style list, things will get weirder, stranger, and even more insane. All the way from boxing to Aikido, down to the delusional world of the Eagle Dragon Snake Master himself. This is not your average stroll through the world of martial arts. This is the history, the rules, the law, and everything in between for the legitimate and for the fakest of the fake martial arts. So get aboard Ocean Gate and get ready to have your brain cells vacuum exploded. We're venturing into the obscure, the disturbing, and the utterly insane. It's time to travel down the rabbit hole. Welcome to the insane and wacky world of every martial arts style.
A lot of the old school martial arts schools were very culty. Very culty.
They're real bricks. I mean, there's no joke. Oh! Wow!
Tier 1. Welcome to Tier 1. This tier will provide a great and important foundation for all other martial art styles to come later in the iceberg. These entries will be familiar to you, but perhaps the minutiae and small details that I'll go over in their summation will surprise you. Some will be more in depth than others, because I'm not going to insult your intelligence. I will talk about the origins of these art forms, some of their more unique techniques, famous practitioners, and sometimes highlight well-known fighters or competitions that have taken place in the respective fights. Just know that in the process of summarizing, especially in this tier, things may be glossed over or oversimplified, but I've tried my absolute best to keep a fast-paced, entertaining style, so sit back, buckle in. The next 3 hours are going to descend into chaos pretty quickly. Pancration. Now let's start with the beginning. The actual beginning, pancration. This is an ancient Greek martial art that is often considered the youngest form of MMA, the sport combining both wrestling and boxing, fun and respected pastimes for the ancient Greeks. Pancration can be traced all the way back to the 2nd millennium BCE. Its name derived from the Greek words pan, meaning all, and kratos, meaning strength.
Careful, boy.
And so, pancration means all-powerful, and as you can imagine with a sport called all-powerful, it was made to determine who indeed was the most all-powerful of them all. The crucible that this most honourable of titles would be decided in was the Olympic Games themselves. Hosted in Olympia in 648 BCE, the first pancration games would have taken place naked, and in oil also.
I want to oil you up. What the does that mean?
Pancration was joined by a couple other sports during the Olympic Games, namely boxing, wrestling, chariot racing, running, and the javelin. Much like all ancient Greek shenanigans, pancration was born out of myths and legends. It was said that Theseus and Hercules alike had used a mixture of wrestling and boxing to subdue mighty beasts and foes. In particular, Theseus had given the Minotaur a stiff jab and a DDT.
I'm not sure what you're talking about. I don't even know what a DDT is. I think that's a WWE move.
It is believed that not only was it used as an excuse to get naked and oil each other up, much like Dana White should have been.
Mr. Dana White.
Mr. Dana White.
We want to oil you up.
We want to oil you up.
But also as a means to train soldiers during this time. Spartans are said to have had a particular interest in the sport. I have no idea why, and that is what made them so deadly on the battlefield. Pancration was a full contact sport, allowing strikes, grappling, wrestling, everything with minimal restriction. The only prohibited actions were biting and gouging an opponent's eyes, nose or mouth. Victory decided either through submission or death. Whilst knockouts did happen, they were actually quite rare apparently. An author during the time writes of a pancration fighter who won an Olympic match after his own death. It turns out that whilst he was in a chokehold, he'd actually broken his opponent's ankle. Pancrationists even had developed their own styles of fighting, not dissimilar as we see today. Techniques included short hooking blows, climbing onto an opponent's back for a chokehold, and other things. Fighters also earned nicknames based on their preferred techniques, such as fingertips, who broke opponents' fingers. Eventually, Rome put some respect on the sport and made fighters wear loincloths and wrap their hands. Much to the dismay of John Jones, naked oil fights no longer take place. Pancration spread eastward with Alexander the Great's conquest, which apparently would have had an impact on Chinese and Indian martial arts to come later on this iceberg. Despite its historic background at the Olympic Games, it was refused entry into the modern Olympics revival, probably because people felt it was too violent, and so we wouldn't see its rule set manifest in the form of a competitive sport until much later. There is a rich and beautiful history of techniques, stances, strikes, submissions, joint locks and throws that pancration developed, stuff that would define the sports to come. So as we get to them, I will highlight where pancration had an influence in a particular sport. Jiu-Jitsu. Over the next part of the iceberg, we are going to set the foundation which leads into the creation of the sport of MMA. As you will come to see, the path to getting there follows a straight lineage, and it starts interestingly with Jiu-Jitsu, also known as Jiu-Jitsu or Jiu-Jitsu. It is a traditional Japanese martial art that focuses on using an opponent's force against them through joint locks, throws, and grappling techniques. Its history spans centuries and is intertwined with the evolution of Japanese warfare and the development of other martial arts. The word comes from Ju, meaning gentle, and Jutsu, meaning art. Interestingly, techniques of Jiu-Jitsu can actually be traced all the way back to 700 AD, where samurai tried to develop basic grappling techniques, although it wasn't until the 15th century that it really started to become a refined school of thought. The Sengoku period was one of intense bloodshed and warfare, and in that chaos of combat, the samurai became better and better grapplers, developing chokes, throws, and joint locks. But this time in Japan was one of rigid class structure, and Jiu-Jitsu was barred from all those that were not in the samurai class or above, and so the fighting and bloodshed continued. The secrets of Jiu-Jitsu passed on secretly in schools and over generations, those different schools handling with care their own styles of Jiu-Jitsu. Trade secrets of how to submit, throw, or manipulate your opponent were all kept under wraps. The martial art also taught techniques on striking. It was mainly established though as a way for the samurai to defend themselves if they ever lost their sword. But then peace befell the lands, and with it came people from all over the world. That once rigid class structure began to fall away, and Jiu-Jitsu permeated into society. With far more people and people from different lands, different perspectives, the art form over the course of a couple hundred years became far more sophisticated and refined. More locks, throws, pressure point strikes, all in an attempt to subdue opponents. But there was still a problem with the sport. Due to the physical nature of it, it was really only practiced by those more physically gifted in society. Fast forward to 1860, and a hero in the world of mixed martial arts was born, Kano Jigoro. He was a small guy, 5 foot 2 inches, 41 kilograms. He was for all intents and purposes far too small for the sport of Jiu-Jitsu. Despite this, he still went to a dojo and tried to make his small frame work in the sport. The fact was, he was just far too small and got tossed around the gym like a basketball. That was, of course, if an instructor or gym would actually allow him to train there, because now famously, he was denied access to training due to his size. This was also combined with the waning popularity of the sport in an increasingly westernized Japan. People were just not that interested in martial arts anymore, and many instructors had to go back to the 9-to-5 grind, considering students just weren't there to pay the bills and keep the dojo lights on. But Kano was determined to make his size a non-factor, and was more determined still to keep the heritage of his country alive by spreading the love of Japan's ancient martial arts legacy. And so he turned to other sports to find inspiration, searching the vast lands of the world for any way to improve his jiu-jitsu proficiency. He trained at several schools and began to make a name for himself on the scene, even trusted to teach lessons at some schools in Tokyo. His search for continued greatness in the sport eventually led him to a new dojo and a new teacher, Laikibo Tsunetoshi, a jiu-jitsu expert who concentrated mainly on throws and trips, and because of this speciality, had developed some interesting and unique techniques for lobbing your opponents to the ground, particularly useful for a smaller person. Kano was inspired by this concentration on a specific aspect of jiu-jitsu and started giving all his spare time to this new instructor. He would combine this speciality and reshape them with his own techniques that he was developing, utilizing the other sports that he had been researching, like Western wrestling, using pivots and physics to his advantage. His philosophy and training differed from other jiu-jitsu practitioners also. The art form was kind of dangerous and brutal, and as a smaller guy, he didn't quite fancy the striking aspect of the sport, which often led to injury, and so his training methods completely avoided all of these factors. His main gripe though was that jiu-jitsu was not a unified system. All these splinter schools and styles only served to segregate tradition and foster a sense of secrecy between schools, and so after dedicating years to jiu-jitsu, he finally went on his own path, opening his own dojo in 1882 and began instructing his unique style, one that made the closed-off sport accessible to everyone of all shapes and sizes, and he did this to great success, becoming a legend on the scene. His distinctive style of jiu-jitsu had escaped its ancient samurai past. This new system was different, very different, and so naturally it needed a new name. How about judo? That's right, we now move on to the next sport on this iceberg, judo. So let's get a little more specific about judo, which quite literally translates to the gentle way, which made sense for what Kano was actually teaching. It was more about efficiency, leverage, but beyond that, it was about moral and spiritual growth as well. Judo had separated itself from jiu-jitsu in two main ways. Firstly, an emphasis on randori over kata, randori being sparring, and kata, which roughly means the practice of techniques in slowed down step or choreographed versions of moves. This focus on randori meant that practitioners were able to refine their skills in realistic, competitive scenarios, allowing the minutiae of moves to present themselves no matter where the fight would tangle up. Judo also all but completely moved away from the use of weapons, which was often practiced in jiu-jitsu schools. Kano's judo focused on two primary techniques: maximum efficiency, minimum effort, and mutual warfare and benefit. Judo quickly gained popularity in Japan, his gym, Kodokan, growing rapidly. Kano was a pioneer. He revolutionized the world of mixed martial arts. Judo began spreading internationally in the early 20th century, and Kano sent many of his best students on expeditions to spread judo to all corners of the globe. Kano would die in the 1930s, unfortunately. 30 years before his creation, would be included as a sport at the Tokyo Olympic Games in 1964, but he died a legend, one of the most influential and respected martial artists the world has ever been graced with. Since his death, the International Judo Federation has been formed, and with it, rules and competitions standardized, leading to its validity as an Olympic sport. Modern competitive judo focuses on throws, pins, joint locks, and strangles. Judo matches are 4 minutes long, and points can be scored in two ways: ippon and waza-ari. An ippon ends the match, achieved by throwing an opponent on their back with speed, strength, and control, or pinning the opponent down for 20 seconds, or via submission. 2 waza-aris are required to end the match. A waza-ari is awarded for a throw that is lacking one of the three elements: speed, strength, and control, or it can be awarded for holding down an opponent between 10 and 19 seconds. Judo has created many excellent martial artists, perhaps most famous among them in our MMA circles is Ronda Rousey, who had won bronze at the Beijing Olympic Games. But judo also was very important in another way, so let's rewind the clock back to the beginning of the 20th century, because now we're moving on to the next sport in this list, which is intrinsically tied to judo, and that is BJ. J. Kano's new system of judo had inspired and developed many legendary students in their own right. One such man was Mitsu Maeda, who had begun instruction under his master in 1895. After proving his worth of being a top student, he was sent off around the world to spread judo's influence. This journey would see him end up in Brazil in 1920. Here he would be asked to instruct the son of a rich entrepreneur who was a bit of a troublemaker and needed his ass kicked to be put back in line. His name was Carlos Gracie. Carlos immediately took to the sport of judo, which confusingly was still kind of being called jiu-jitsu at the time. He invited his brother, Elio Gracie, to come along also. Elio, much like Kano, was a very small, non-athletic man, unable to do a lot of the judo throws that the sport was known for, but what he was great at was the submissions on the ground. Elio, through his practice of judo, would come up with new ways of taking his opponents down, tripping them, and using leverage to his advantage against his much larger foes, dragging them down to the mat, where he would then quickly submit them. Elio's style had begun to develop into its own thing, departing from the throws and more physical movements of judo. It had a particular emphasis on ground control and submissions and locks, and so Elio and Carlos Gracie decided it was time to open their own gym and start their new teaching system called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And so it was here, a school built from the blood, sweat and tears of two brothers trying to claim their throne in the city's combat sports scene. It was here where they would post newspaper ads offering to break people's arms or ribs, the so-called Gracie Challenge. The reason for offering such a glorious challenge was to assert their stamp of dominance in the Vale Tudo sport, famous in Brazil, and kind of a precursor for the sport of MMA to come. Their sole intention was to show that their Gracie Jiu-Jitsu system was far superior than any other means of defense, and they were willing to put many people into hospital to illustrate their point. But beyond that, proving that a small man like Elio could destroy larger opponents would mean that more students would go to their gym and more money in their pockets. The Gracies would continue to relentlessly improve their new martial arts system, creating new techniques on the ground, new submissions, and new ways of utilizing the gi. And then not only that, proving its efficiency by pitting their students against other fighting styles such as boxing, luta livre, capoeira, and luta romana in Vale Tudo fights. The 1950s saw the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu system hit new levels of popularity, Elio leading the vanguard by participating in high-profile challenge matches, taking on men of various different fighting styles, but most importantly, judokas, showing that this evolution of judo was meant to be far superior. This led to the now infamous matchup against Masahiko Kaimura, a man who outweighed Elio significantly, and in front of 20,000 people, Elio would have his arm snapped by letting it get twisted behind his back. Kaimura using the Gayaka Ude Garame, something that you now fittingly know as the Kaimura. But the fight, considering the time, was viral, and BJJ shot up into the stratosphere. Before you knew it, people were clambering to enter gyms to learn BJJ's unique moves, triangle chokes, joint locks, leg submissions, but most importantly, the rather strange proposition of starting in the guard. From wearing the iconic gi and the rigid and fetishized belt system, BJJ had its own identity. It had real power in the martial arts world, and for what it's worth, the Gracies had changed the face of combat, but that would never have happened if it wasn't for the samurai, Kano, and Maeda. It's an interesting story that led all the way to BJJ starting to take over. In 1966, the first ever BJJ World Championships took place in Rio de Janeiro. In 2002, Carlos Gracie Jr. formed the International Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation, IBJJF, and BJJ started spreading rapidly from country to country. Jiu-Jitsu continues to grow and evolve continuously, with new techniques and moves being constantly introduced. New academies are opening worldwide. Pretty much every large town near you will have a place to train this sport. In the last 2.5 decades, the sport of BJJ has splintered into many different styles and factions, from no-gi to 10th Planet, and speciality schools like Danaher, who focuses on leg locks. Metas have come and gone, from guard pullers to mold breakers like Eddie Bravo. Famous competitions include the IBJJF World Championships and the ADCC held in Abu Dhabi. Organizations like One Championship have also started putting grappling fights in their live shows, crowning grapplers with their iconic championship belts. BJJ is truly ingrained in the world of mixed martial arts and has become one of the most famous martial arts styles in the world. Gracies have kind of claimed ownership of the sport, but it is also fair to say that during the mid-1900s, there were many other styles and factions that were also highly influential on the sport. They often don't receive the credit that they deserve, but now we rewind the clock back to 1993, because now a new sport was starting: MMA. BJJ and the Gracies were about to set the stage for the creation of a new sport, the martial art of every martial art, from striking, grappling, and ground fighting, a crucible that combined all martial arts worldwide, and it starts with UFC 1, aptly named The Beginning. 7,800 people would stand in attendance to watch 8 men, each with a particular skill set in a martial art, compete in a tournament with no weight class. These men were brought in to showcase their combat sport discipline and to prove that their craft was worthy of the Ultimate Fighting Championship crown. The concept was simple: the men would battle it out in a bracketed system over the course of one night and make their way to the finals. It was a rather strange affair, far removed from the transgressions that take place in the octagon today. Particular highlights are this guy with one boxing glove on, and this guy, a 300-pound sumo wrestler. But much to the surprise of many, it was the comparatively small and unassuming Royce Gracie that would walk away with the title, submitting all his opponents along the way. It would transpire that to some degree, the whole concept of the UFC had been developed simply as a promotion of the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu system itself. Rorion Gracie, Elio's son, had founded the UFC along with Art Davie and the SEG group. Gracie knew, or well hoped, going into the tournament that the Gracie's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu would have the upper hand over every other martial art. It was essentially a setup with the intent of embarrassing all the other combat sport practitioners and to further rub salt into the wound. The only reason Royce Gracie was chosen to represent the family was because he was the smaller and skinnier of the Gracies, further elevating the effectiveness of jiu-jitsu. So much to the unaware of the audience, who was simply there to be enamored by the brutal spectacle, they were witnessing the Gracie dynasty asserting their dominance over the fighting world itself. The relative success of the show promised to return, and return it did. There were several precursors that hinted at this sport to come. Obviously, the several different martial arts that we've mentioned in the lead up to this one, but specifically Vale Judo. It was a seed that was growing in the soil, ready to sprout into MMA. Japan and China had regularly entertained cross-sports competitions such as Jiu-Jitsu versus Kung Fu, or perhaps most famously, the 1976 exhibition match between boxer Muhammad Ali and wrestler Inoki, which later inspired the creation of organizations like Shuto in 1985 and Pancrase in 1993, and one of my favorites, Pride Fighting Championships in 1997. The term mixed martial arts was actually coined from a review that some journalists used in the build-up to UFC 1, and since then, MMA has become the sport that we know and love today. From 5-second KOs to insane submissions, this sport has changed all our lives just a little. I'm not going to bang on about MMA too much, because if you're on this channel, then you certainly know a thing or two about this sport, and if you don't, well, I don't know. Go watch one of my videos or something. Rules have very little variations. Tiny things like one championship will allow knees on the ground to the head, whereas the UFC won't, or maybe different ways of running events or organizations, from tournaments to leagues to championships and rankings. Whatever floats your boat, there is something out there for you. UFC, One Championship, PFL, Bellator, it's all great stuff. MMA has managed to bring in all forms and all styles from all backgrounds to the 8-sided crucible to prove whose art holds the most danger, to see which man can blend as many forms together in beautiful warfare. Through this concoction, we've seen many sports that may not have had the attention before get a spotlight shone on them, from Islam Makhachev representing the world of Sambo, the American gangster in wrestling, or even Yuri and Bujitsu. Many schools have given a firm foundation to the practitioners that we love to watch, and as the rest of this video unfolds, bear in mind that the interweaving of all of these sports is what defines MMA. Every sport is unique, interesting, and important. Sometimes they influence one another, from Jiu-Jitsu into Judo, into BJJ, and then MMA. They grow alongside each other, offshoots, mixtures, whatever it is. Martial arts and their different art forms are special, and their history ever so entertaining. Wrestling. On an overcast day in the autumn of 1940, a young 18-year-old boy and his dog stumbled upon a dark and dingy entrance into a damp cave, revealed after a tree had overturned. The quaint and small village in southern western France would become home to an extraordinary discovery. Etched onto the walls of this cave were the crude and ancient markings of a people from long ago. 15,000 years earlier, men and women had scrawled upon the rocks paintings of animals, humans, and landscapes, but amongst these drawings were that of a sport, men's limbs tangled in competition, some of the first bits of evidence of the sport of wrestling, discovered in the most unlikely of ways, and we see this sport weaved into the fabric of history in many different cultures, from Babylonian reliefs depicting that of practitioners utilizing joint manipulation to even references of this sport in the Old Testament. In Genesis, wrestling is first mentioned during a story that has Jacob, one of the Bible's greatest figures, at the forefront. One night, around 2000 BC near a brook north of the Dead Sea, Jacob was tenaciously wrestling with a stranger. Jacob struggled valiantly until his thigh was injured, perhaps due to wrestling joint manipulation. Some Ryan Hall leg lock shenanigans courtesy of a stranger. Jacob clinged onto the stranger and said he would not let go until the stranger blessed him. Jacob was bestowed the name Israel, which translates to wrestler with God. How about that for an origin story for a mixed martial art? From the Iliad to ancient Indian epics, wrestling has been mentioned many times, but it is in ancient Greece where the sport would find itself. Greek wrestling, referred to as pale, which can be translated into erect wrestling, which really does follow suit for the Greeks. It is apparent from the history books that wrestling was a massive part of ancient Greek culture. Theseus of Athens is credited with inventing this form of wrestling, although he is also credited with killing centaurs, so I'm not exactly sure how much I'm going to buy into that one. As with most forms of wrestling, erect wrestling's primary objective was to throw big muscly men to the ground from a standing position. Unlike other wrestling forms to come, pinning was not a part of erect wrestling technique. A point in Greek wrestling was scored when a wrestler managed to make his opponent's back or shoulders touch the ground. The first wrestler to score 3 points was decided the winner. Compared to pankration, Greek wrestling was less brutal, leading to it appealing to many young Greeks of all sizes. A surviving papyrus from the 2nd century AD reveals to us that Ben Askren truly is a time traveller, as the ancient Greek wrestlers are documented as being adept in techniques such as headlocks, joint locks, and shoulder locks. In these ancient matches, wrestlers could utilize chokeholds. From the Roman Empire to the modern age, from the east to the west, men have just wanted to slam their bodies together. The British would eventually take wrestling across the pond, manifesting not only destiny, but singlets also. It would also prove to be popular amongst many North American colonies and even Native Americans, eventually permanently entering the Olympics in 1904. The NCAA would be established in 1928, perhaps the most famous format and organization from wrestling that most Westerners know today. Without complicating this video any more than it has to be, there are many different forms and styles of wrestling that have been developed since ancient times, most notably Greco-Roman, freestyle, and perhaps most importantly, oil wrestling. The rules vary from style to style, but the intention is always the same and stays in line with the ancient Greeks. One man attempts to put their opponent on the mat, submit them, pin them, trip them, whatever it takes to get them points. Many of these different styles you will see as we go deeper down the iceberg, so wait out for more context. Boxing. Since humans had hands, they've wanted to punch each other. No truer statement can be made on this iceberg, that's for sure. You know the deal. Disagreements often lead to violence, and for us as Homo sapiens, that starts with a clenched fist and a wild swing. So it is no surprise that this natural instinct would be gamified over time. We mentioned earlier that boxing was one of the sports that was hosted at the original Olympic Games, and so a little more on that. A match had no fixed duration, but ended when one of the fighters either submitted from strikes, was knocked out, or, like a pussy, died. Weight categories were not a thing. Age categories were, however, which I guess makes sense. To protect their hands, boxers would drape them in leather with a little lining of wool for a little bit of cushion, which is quite interesting considering that over 1,000 years later, real gloves would be introduced into the sport. It surprised me to learn though that whilst training, Greeks would still use a leather bag to train on. Boxing was a purely stand-up sport at the Olympics. Punching was only illegal to the groin. Because of the hard leather wraps, faces would be brutally scarred, and for this reason, Greeks considered this to be the most ruthless sport of them all held at the Olympics. Since this most ancient of times, boxing has taken many forms and varied massively in its rule set, split over vast areas of the world. Little communities would make their own ways of smacking each other in the face fun. This will become more obvious as we go down the iceberg, and this initial game of boxing would develop into many different sports, from Thai boxing to Lethwei. There would be fleeting mentions of fistfights for hundreds of years in between the Olympics and now, from punch-ups in Italy to knuckle sandwiches in mid-century Slavic states. Boxing experienced an Oasis-esque comeback in Britain around the 17th century though. Many bouts were fought bare knuckle, and with no standard rules until Jack Broughton introduced boxing rules known as Broughton's Law in the 18th century. However, many boxers still chose to fight with bare knuckles until 1867, when gloves were mandated by the Marquess of Queensberry rules, which is often what people think of when referring to boxing as a sport. The rules have changed very little since their introduction. Anything before this time is often referred to as classic pugilism. You can see the rules for Queensberry on screen now. Through the late 19th century, the martial art of boxing was considered a rather illegal one, and so for that reason, prize fights were often held at gambling venues and broken up by the police. Coming into the 20th century, however, boxing, which had been struggling to form any semblance of legitimacy, was starting to turn the tide, as popularity and commercial success brought higher purses and crowd attendance. Prize fighters were swapping rings stuffed inside of dilapidated illegal casinos for the lights, crowd and glitz of sold-out arenas. John L. Sullivan, with a win over Dominic McCaffrey in 1885, had set in motion a 100-year-long dominant reign of American heavyweight world champions. From the Galveston giant Jack Johnson, the first African-American to lay claim to the title in 1908, to Jack Dempsey, Sonny Liston, and Muhammad Ali, boxing had set the stage for a storied legacy, one that would ultimately define society and capture the imagination of people worldwide. Those wars fought inside the ring were vicariously elevating the population through boxers who were showing that grit, toughness and heart are all the deciding factor in conquering our hopes and dreams. All you must do is look inside the living room of an average American household in the late 1970s and you'd see Sylvester Stallone reminding us to get back up and take life by the horns at our lowest moments. Reduced to its base, boxing is hope. But then came along modern boxing. Modern boxing. Or as I like to call it, the most corrupt sport in existence. Gone are the stories my granddad told me of fighters, spoken as if they were legends of myth, fables of slugfests between Rocky Marciano and Jersey Joe Walcott, tales of Muhammad Ali's greatest knockouts. Instead, we are harpooned with multiple scummy organizations with their own titles, their own rankings, whose sole aim is to put themselves above the others, pulling titles, enforcing fights, and blocking super fights from ever taking place. Multiply this with suspect refs and even more suspect scorecards, and you have yourself a recipe for a clinical, boring, political shit show that has turned the sport into trash. Stars align, only briefly, fleeting moments of hope that are quickly soured by the usual turning of the wheel. I hate modern boxing with a passion, and I feel sorry for those fans who are clinging on, watching the game be mutilated by money and bad actors. It has literally taken the Saudis, with unlimited money, to even attempt to stitch this dying corpse back together. Boxing is boxing. I don't like it very much, and the Queensberry rules speak for themselves. I can see why so many people yearn for that golden era of boxing. Muhammad Ali, George Foreman and Joe Frazier. Boxing is perhaps the most commercially successful combat sport on this planet, and much like BJJ, I'm not going to insult your intelligence by banging on about it. So moving on to Kung Fu. Wushu and Kung Fu are almost interchangeable words for the term Chinese martial arts. China, a country rich in tradition and combat, has a very storied legacy of martial systems. A common saying in Chinese martial arts is as follows: train both internal and external. External training includes the hands, the eyes, the body, and stances. Internal training includes the heart, the spirit, the mind, and breath. This is perhaps the biggest thing that you'll see as we specify martial arts later on in the video. Some have certain proclivities to either internal or external techniques. Internal is often done through deep meditation, breath, and the use of qi or energy that we will discuss later, or even through study, training the mind. External is what you might very well imagine it to be, training of techniques through sparring, strength exercises, developing speed and power, done through movements, routines, or stuff like yoga. All of this will be done often through forms, or taolu, these iconic, choreographed routines that simulate fighting techniques against imaginary opponents. So, how did Chinese martial arts first start? Well, it is said that in some way or another, Chinese martial arts have existed for over 4,000 years, but the first physical evidence of martial arts being mentioned is the 5th century BC, where in the famous Chinese chronicle, Spring and Autumn Annals, hand-to-hand combat is mentioned, with discussion around hard and soft techniques. Also mentioned was a form of wrestling. Many believe that they were formed for hunting and military purposes, but it isn't until centuries later, around 700 AD, is where Chinese martial arts as we know it today was formalized, specifically in Shaolin temples, although evidence is scarce in this era, but it was the 15th and 16th century where a plethora of evidence clearly shows that practicing Shaolin Kung Fu was an intrinsic part of monastic life. It is here where the iconic use of the staff was recorded as well. Due to the vastness of China though, its many states and eras of rule, there have been distinct splits in styles between northern and southern Chinese states, and so often people refer to branches of Kung Fu being either related to northern or southern Shaolin. We will discuss the differences later in the video in detail, but to add more confusion, there are, in total, over 400 different variations of Kung Fu, from Tai Chi to Li Ga. Kung Fu is deeply influenced by Chinese philosophy, including Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. This, understandably, has had particular influence on the internal training methods, in particular, spiritual growth. One of the more iconic things about Kung Fu is the use of animal styles. Some systems are inspired and tied to nature and so embody the movements and characteristics of animals, most notably the tiger, crane, snake, monkey and dragon. Each animal style is unique in their different techniques, strategies and mental attitudes. It's best to think of Kung Fu, Shaolin or Wushu as a system that incorporates a wide range of techniques that includes punching, kicking, grappling, and the use of weapons such as swords, staffs, spears, and other traditional Chinese weapons. Much like traditional Japanese martial arts systems, it is all-encompassing and was used to train the military and populace alike. Some are more focused than others, and I look forward to expanding on Chinese martial arts as we go down the video, but now we move on to karate. Chinese martial arts, specifically those of the Shaolin Temple, surprisingly heavily influenced karate, which I used to believe was solely a Japanese martial arts system. Okinawa, which is one island of an archipelago southeast of Japan, and one that is extremely close to the Chinese mainland. Whilst it was home to an independent kingdom, it however was eventually invaded and annexed courtesy of those pesky samurai in the early 16th century. This invasion would see the samurai ban all weapons on the island to nip any potential uprising in the bud. This would see the population of Okinawa develop their traditional martial arts system, and they would do this in secrecy, hiding their training from their oppressors. In 1875, the set of islands would become formally a part of Japan, and around this time, karate, which meant Chinese hand, would have its spelling changed to open hand, although the pronunciation was the same, karate. I'm not sure how that works exactly, maybe somebody who can speak Japanese can explain that in the comments, but now this new saying, open hand, emphasized the fact that this martial arts system was about unarmed combat. Karate is a self-defense system concerned with punches, kicks, knee strikes, and open hand techniques. Those open hand techniques perhaps being the most recognizable and unique thing about this martial arts system. Karate practitioners also focus on blocking, parrying, and deflection. Kichin Funakoshi, a man often referred to as the father of modern karate, would bring the martial art over to mainland Japan in the early 20th century. By removing some of the more brutal and vicious techniques, it made the martial arts system more accessible to people of all ages, which would see it enter school curriculums around the empire. He also took influence from sports like judo at the time and introduced a ranking structure and the gi. It became absolutely beloved by the people of the country, not only because it taught self-defense, but because it had a particular emphasis on spiritual growth. Then, the 80s and 90s began, and well, this happened. These movies are revered and looked back on with great nostalgia. They defined an era in Western worlds. Many of the older gentlemen I work with to this day talk about their fascination with these insane movies and the stars that spawned out of them. Whilst the 20 years prior of movies had generated great interest in Chinese martial arts, it was this era that springboarded karate. From Chuck Norris to Claude Van Damme, they made karate a household name, and before you knew it, dojos were opening up across the globe. Karate was cool, karate was it, and even when I was a kid in the late 90s and early 2000s, I was going around karate chopping every innocent peer in the playground, fascinated with videos of boards and blocks being destroyed with a single strike. Karate was just cool, and I don't know what else to tell you. The father of karate often referred to the kara part of the name to mean purge oneself of selfish and evil thoughts, for only with a clear mind and conscience can the practitioner understand the knowledge which he receives. This martial arts system instills lessons of humbleness and gentleness. After all, it is a form of defense, and proficiency in it means that you as a person can present a great danger to other people. Therefore, restraint and peace are above all, violence and action only a last resort. There are many different styles of karate, from Shotokan, Koju Ryu, Shitu Ryu, and Wado Ryu, each emphasizing different aspects of the art, such as power, fluidity, and speed. Some of these we will get back to later on in the video. Most interestingly, karate has become an Olympic sport as of the 2021 Tokyo Olympics. Also, does anyone remember that time that Claude Van Damme pissed off hot-headed Cody Garbrandt? Muay Thai. The art of 8 limbs finally makes its way onto this iceberg, one of the most technical and exciting sports in my opinion, besides MMA. It's the only other sport that I follow actually. The art of Muay Thai would first be branded in the early 20th century, rising from the ashes of an ancient martial art called Muay, one that the ancient Siamese soldiers used as a form of self-defense when weapons were lost. Much like how the samurai also had their means of defense when weaponless, this form of combat would continue to flourish in the land of Siam, a place now known as Thailand. King Rama VII would eventually modernize the sport in the early 20th century, introducing Western-style boxing gloves, getting rid of the ropes that were often used to cover the hands. He also codified rules with rounds, refs, and even weight divisions, and placing the fighters in a ring. Muay Thai is actually just commonly referred to as boxing in Thailand. Muay Thai bouts of 5 3-minute rounds with 2 minutes in between. Both fighters attempt to win a match by utilizing their fists, feet, elbows, knees, and chins. A fight is won by knockout, 3 knockdowns in a round, or decision. The mid-1950s would see the establishment of perhaps the most famous and revered stadium when it comes to this sport, Lumpini, which has its home in Bangkok. This crucible that sits thousands has seen some of the most brutal and satisfying fights this sport has ever known, crowning many champions and honouring the blood god with its hospitality to savages. Stadiums like Lumpini cropped up one after another, which only further solidified this sport as the country's favoured form of violence. Muay Thai is often practiced by children as well, with amateur children fights being put on regularly. It's something that I have covered in a 45-minute documentary on my channel already, which also goes over the history of Muay Thai as well. So if you would like more historical and societal context, then please feel free to check out that banger after you finish this one. Personally, it's one of my favourite videos that I've ever made. Muay Thai fights started to spread to all corners of the globe fairly quickly, and organisations followed suit, putting on the line legendary title fights and putting super fights together also. Muay Thai fighters are also known for their ridiculous records. For example, Bakor, the sport's greatest legend, has an awe-inspiring record of 240 wins, 24 losses and 13 draws, and those kind of records are simply not uncommon. Perhaps not with so many wins though. Fighting almost every weekend, the Thais are truly some of the world's greatest warriors. One of the most characteristic things of Muay Thai is the ritual that takes place beforehand, a ceremony that pays respect to their teachers, ancestors, and the sport itself. It's ingrained into the sport. This is joined by the sacred headband and armbands that they wear. Beyond being important aspects of this sport's traditions, they are also actually used for good luck and protection. And as you can see, Jonathan Haggerty wasn't wearing one against Superlek at the start of last month, and he got elbowed into next Tuesday. Muay Thai over the last couple years has become one of my favourite sports to watch. It's vicious, it's exciting, but it has some of the best striking that you'll ever see. If you want an easy segue into watching this sport, I highly recommend checking out One Championship's Friday night fights, or even one of their upcoming pay-per-views. What a fantastic sport, which leads quite nicely into our next entry on this list. Modern kickboxing. Kickboxing has a rather complicated history, and many versions of it grew alongside each other, and so kickboxing as we know it now was taking roots in the mid-1900s. It blended in many ways the previous 2 entries on this iceberg, karate and Muay Thai, but also, as the name suggests, boxing, using those unique thick padded gloves. Unlike Muay Thai though, it did away with the elbows, and whilst yes, there are some organisations and rule sets that allow elbows, it is rather uncommon in this sport. One man who is credited for kind of kicking this whole whole show off is a Japanese karateka, Tatsuo Yamada, who wanted to blend karate with the hard-hitting strikes of Muay Thai. His idea began to take shape in the early 1960s when fighters from both disciplines started facing off from each other in competitions, trying to see which martial art was the most effective. But Tatsuo started tweaking the rules to balance the two styles. By the mid-1960s, the term kickboxing was born, with the first events held in Osaka, making the beginnings of kickboxing as we know it. The 1970s and 80s saw kickboxing start to take roots beyond Japan. North America and Europe quickly started seeing people get their souls kicked out of them. Funny enough, in North America, kickboxing and full contact karate were often treated as the same thing due to the vague rules and the remarkable similarities between them. I guess Americans just couldn't figure out the difference. In Europe, kickboxing struggled to gain any traction until the 1990s, when it finally started to become more popular. Since the 90s, the sport has been dominated by Japan's K1 promotion, with other organizations trying to keep up, from ISKA to PKA. My personal favorite organization is Glory, which has spewed out the other side of it many gods of MMA, Israel Adesanya and Alex Pereira for example. Kickboxing has a plethora of nasty kicks in its toolkit, such as roundhouse kicks, front kicks and side kicks, combining it with boxing techniques such as jabs, hooks, uppercuts and straight punches. There are a few main styles that are popular in the world of kickboxing, from American to Dutch and Japanese respectively. Because I have gone over the history of Muay Thai, karate and boxing, I'm sure you get the idea of what this sport entails, and so there are some other cool kickboxing styles that I'll get into a little bit later, so look forward to that. Taekwondo. It's flashy, dynamic, fast, and diverse in its amount of kicks and strikes. It is a very unique looking sport. Oh, and they break a lot of boards, like a lot of boards. There has been a particular drive by the Korean government to kind of sell this story that Taekwondo is Korean and Korean only, using evidence of murals and tapestries showing that Koreans have been practicing martial arts for eons. But I mean, so is every place on earth. It's not exactly unique, and so to suggest that this sport is uninfluenced by other countries and cultures is kind of bananas to me, especially when other sports happily embrace the cultural hodgepodge that takes place as humans traverse the 7 continents and feed into each other. But Korea has decided that they want to spin that Taekwondo is only a Korean sport. My point of saying this is that whilst researching this and reading up on its beginnings, there is a lot of conflicting reports as to what came from where and at what point. And so I guess it's easier to say that Korea has had hand-to-hand combat for thousands of years, but Taekwondo as a system didn't really become a thing until after the Second World War, where new martial arts schools known as Kwons began to emerge in Seoul, the capital of South Korea. These schools were founded by Korean martial artists who had trained in various Japanese and Chinese martial arts during their time of displacement due to the war. Their teachings found its way into the military when 2 officers put on a demonstration which was then mistaken as a traditional Korean martial art known as Taekon by the South Korean president at the time. Taekon, which is a martial art that we'll be getting to later in the iceberg. The president then ordered that a single system of Korean martial art be developed for the military. It's a rather complicated story with politics, personalities and nationalism involved, but the long and short of it, without boring you, is that Taekwondo was born from this incident, something that was sold to the military and subsequently to the country as a uniquely Korean creation with ancient roots. And whilst some of this is true, it is also influenced by Japanese and Chinese martial arts. There was a lot of back and forth of what this new system should be called, but eventually the Kwons relented and Taekwondo was named as the new system. This is an oversimplification of what happened in this scenario, but I think you get the gist. Taekwondo is very stylized, known for its massive variations of kicking techniques, unique stances, and its concentration on speed and aggression. It puts a particular emphasis on being as flashy as possible. Kicks to the head and spinning attacks are rewarded with extra points in competitions. You can also see on my screen now how many different kicking techniques are used in this martial art, which shows you just how specific this sport can be. Because Taekwondo was born from the president's desire to systemize, practitioners of this sport can expect a very rigid plan in their development as a Taekwondoist, or whatever they're called. The curriculum is overseen for the most part by the ITF, the International Taekwondo Federation. Taekwondo's massive popularity in the country has seen it not only become a competed sport worldwide, but also an Olympic sport as of the 2000 Olympics. The sport is also split into various different weight classes as well, not dissimilar to MMA in a lot of ways in the amount of separation and amount of brackets. Although the Olympics are tight asses and squash them into 4 different weight classes. Strikes in the sport are done to certain areas, which will score a set amount of points. The fight can be won via decision, point superiority, or knockout. Practitioners have an 8-meter wide octagon, circle, or square to compete in. There are 3 2-minute rounds with 1-minute rest in between each, and practitioners of this sport will be geared up in protective equipment. Taekwondo, like BJJ, has a belt structure that can vary from gym to gym, but here is an example of a commonly used system on screen now. Students are put through strict tests to determine if they will be upgraded in belt color. One thing that makes Taekwondo quite unique is its philosophy, which, like any good cult, has commandments and tenets, which I can imagine brings a lot of belonging and identity to this sport. Fencing. Who the fuck put fencing on this list? Wait, is it classified as a martial art? Oh, it is. Okay. Well, let me tell you about fencing. It is my understanding that every upper class nonce at my secondary school were the only ones that would actually do fencing. So do with that information what you will. As you can imagine, since men have decided to stab each other in order to gain any kind of valuable resource, there are those who seek to prove that they are the best at stabbing each other. And so, the story of armed combat stretches back to the dawn of humanity, beginning with primitive weapons like clubs, spears, axes, and knives. As societies advanced, so did their weapons. The Bronze Age saw the emergence of fighting techniques with shields and swords, whilst the Middle Bronze Age introduced the fearsome khopesh. By the Late Bronze Age, the sword had taken its iconic form. Intriguingly, the earliest recorded fencing match is depicted on the walls of an ancient Egyptian temple dating back to around 1200 BC. Homer's epic, the Iliad, vividly recounts early combat scenes where heroes clashed with shields, swords, and spears in one-on-one duels. The Romans later institutionalized such combat through gladiatorial games. In Rome, gymnasias and baths were common venues for fencing practice, where combatants used sticks and padded tips. The military strategist Vegetus detailed Roman training methods, emphasizing the thrust over the cut for its lethal efficiency. The thrust would pierce vital organs directly. This preference for thrusting was later refined by Italian fencing masters in the 16th century, shaping the techniques of both the Italian and French schools of fencing. Schools for fencing have believed to have existed from as long ago as the 12th century. Modern fencing, however, began in the late 15th century with the introduction of the rapier, a thrusting sword popular in Spain and Italy, which eventually spread across Europe. By the mid-17th century, the rapier was replaced by a lighter, more maneuverable foil. To practice safely, the foil was developed with rules restricting target areas and establishing right-of-way. For 200 years, foil fencing was taught as an essential skill for gentlemen, and the invention of the wire mask in the 18th century further advanced the sport. With the foil in mind, 2 more variations of fencing was developed as well, épée and sabre, with slight differences in their design and approach to rules. Épée fencing emerged in France in 1860 as a reaction against the strict conventions of the foil fencing. It became the first weapon to be electrified in the 1930s, emphasizing speed. It no longer became about hitting and not being hit, but rather who could hit someone else before 1/25th of a second before getting hit themselves. The machine the sabers linked to would provide evidence as to who had won. Saber fencing, the final version of fencing on this list, is derived from military swordsmanship, and it was refined into a lightweight sporting weapon by Italian masters in the 19th century. Today, fencing is characterized by the incredible speed of the weapon's tip, with fencers reacting instinctively to their opponent's moves thanks to thousands and thousands of hours of practice. Did you know though that Nazi SS officers, who were from the upper class population of Germany, would fence each other with no masks on, which would grant them many scars on their face? The head honchos were all wandering around with horrific scars on their faces. Welcome to Tier 2. Here things start to get off the beaten track a little. Included are martial arts systems that are still commercialized, but perhaps not widely practiced. Aikido.
Don't do it!
Yes, it's time for some Steven Seagal, the man of myth. I'm not going to lie, when I started writing this iceberg, I thought I understood what Aikido was, and now it's become pretty obvious to me that I might have missed the whole point. And so I want to preface this next segment with the fact that Aikido has been absolutely hijacked by Bushido senseis, which has contributed to countless videos of the ridiculous shit that you have more than likely come to associate Aikido with. And because of the prevalence of this nonsense, When I bring up Aikido in the video to follow, just bear in mind what I have to say about the true roots of Aikido and how it might have actually originally provided utility if not for these hijackers. Aikido, as I've come to learn, isn't exactly about how good you can fight someone. Whilst it is a defense system, yes, equally, it's a life philosophy, it's spirituality, it is about harmony and non-violence.
The goal is not killing or meeting force with force, the goal is keeping people safe in Aikido.
That's
the
why
goal
I
in
brought
like
up
Krav
wrestling.
Maga is to kill you, or to kill your opponent as quickly as possible.
But if it comes to it, it's not about attack, but rather blending with an opponent's movements and using their energy against them, resolving a situation with as little force and damage as possible. It's about calming the mind and peace. It was founded by Yushiba, a man born in 1883, but he is more widely known as O-sensei, meaning great teacher. O-sensei was a true Bujitsu expert, highly trained in many different traditional martial arts.
He was an all-round Bujitsu master. He was like in Jiu-Jitsu, Kendo, karate, all these things.
But later in life, his life philosophy changed and he instead looked to bring around a time of non-violence and peace, and felt that martial arts could lead a vanguard in this new way of thinking.
He joined the same movement for pacifism that Gandhi was a part of in like the 20s.
This brought around the creation of Aikido, a sport that is grounded in peaceful resolutions. But O-sensei also understood that if one cannot resolve another's violence or aggression, then defense was absolutely necessary. And so the system is centered around this concept. It's about ending a fight as quickly as possible in the safest and most direct way. Techniques typically include throws, pins, strikes, and even weapons if necessary. Whilst there is a set standard of things to be taught that resembles a lot of other Japanese martial arts that we have discussed previously, like judo, O-sensei also taught that there are no rules and that spontaneous reaction is key to surviving encounters also. This redirecting of energy and the entangling of opponents that O-sensei taught ends up with a really unique looking style that Aikido is known for. So with all of that in mind, how the hell did we end up with this stuff? People just sprinting at other people full force and then somersaulting? The answer is, I really don't know. It seems that something just got lost along the way with this martial art.
Aikido works on a philosophy of positive versus negative energy. An aggressive act, such as an attack upon an innocent person, is negative force. Defense is positive, and according to Aikido, will always win as long as one remains in contact with the universe.
Because Aikido has its roots in traditional martial arts, it would be foolish to suggest that it doesn't have utility in real life against untrained men. But man, these videos really just spoil the whole thing for me. I don't get it, and I don't understand why this happens. Perhaps someone can comment below and explain why these people just run at each other and fall over.
The power of the Aikido master lies in an accumulation of ki, the power of mind, but it can be deadly when applied directly. Aikido, or being one with the universe, as Steve says, produces some unbelievable results. We don't know how this power works, but we're about to see it demonstrated even more dramatically.
I don't want to shit on it too much, because frankly, it's way too easy. I was watching a video by Jesse Enkamp when researching this segment, and the guy that he sparred with in this video actually did a really good job of explaining what Aikido is in a more digestible way, without all that fluff and crap that Aikido is known for, and the comments really did agree with what I was thinking when watching it. Jesse then sparred the man, and I think he genuinely did a good job of displaying what Aikido would look like when it's not being spouted by some moron flipping 20 guys over. And whilst it's easy and compelling to just spend 5 minutes laughing at this martial art, I genuinely think that if you want to strip it down to its effectiveness in a street fight, that an Aikido guy would do quite well against your average human walking the planet.
It works if someone doesn't know what they're doing, or if you have a lot of physical attributes. Like Seagal's a huge guy. He's a very big guy. And he probably could pull that off on a lot of people who don't know how to fight.
But as Joe said, you come up against a D1 wrestler, and the only thing that you are going to be redirecting are phone calls from the hospital trying to collect their bill. As a martial art for health benefits, mental health and spirituality, I'm sure Aikido is a good thing for people. Can't say I'll be walking in a gym anytime soon though. Tai Chi. Tai Chi is another martial art coming from the lands of China. Although for this particular entry, I think it would be better to say that the martial arts aspect of Tai Chi comes last, as it's more well known for its concentration on spirituality, philosophy, health benefits, meditation, and graceful movements. Extensive scientific research has concluded that its proclaimed life-changing effects are not really nonsense either. Tai Chi has been proven to improve balance, flexibility, cardiovascular health, stress levels, and overall well-being. Tai Chi is characterized by its long, flowing movements, giving it that rather distinctive look. This is done as a form of body conditioning exercise with the intent to harmonize the yin and the yang, done so by either passive techniques or active ones, the opposite making the whole, internal and external, everything in perfect balance. These flowing, rhythmic and deliberate movements are done so in particular stances and positions, stylized after many different animals, the bear and the snake for example. Tai Chi is also where Qi or energy makes its way onto this list, as it's certainly relevant for the next entry after this, and most definitely important as we go to the murky depths of this iceberg, where things get, well, interesting, let's say that. Energy, or Qi, or Qi, flows through the body along energy pathways called meridians. If the flow of Qi is blocked or unbalanced in any point upon the pathway, it is thought that you have become ill. So bear this in mind when we talk about energy going forward. This concept is what is being referenced. You do Tai Chi to increase energy flow. This is done through the movements and the stances. Although it was once formed as a self-defense and attack system, it is characterized by being mainly defensive in nature, but also included in this martial art is the use of weapons. This system for the most part resembles Kung Fu that was included in the first tier, so I'm not going to tread over old ground, but what is most fascinating about Tai Chi is just how old it is. Evidence suggests that Tai Chi was practiced in China as early as the 3rd century. There are several styles, including Yang, Chen, Wu, and Sun, each with its own unique stylings. The Yang style is the most popular, and the one that is often most seen around the world. Tai Chi is of extreme national pride in China, none so more evident than that 10-second clip of the Tai Chi guy getting knocked out by an MMA dude.
That a Chinese Tai Chi master tried to fight an MMA fighter and just got obliterated in 10 seconds.
The backstory behind this is that both men were from China, and because the MMA dude essentially discredited China's identity surrounding Tai Chi by showcasing its ineffectiveness, he was forced to go into hiding, not only from the government, but a mob of angry Chinese men and women.
And this guy's had to hide. This Chinese MMA fighters had to go into hiding because people are offended that he battered this Tai Chi master and made their country look bad. Because it's making their traditional martial art look ineffective. What's really bizarre is Tai Chi's not really a physical fighting martial art. It's supposed to be something that's more of like a meditative movement.
Like yoga.
And I guess that's something that we talked about at the start of this tier. Sometimes martial arts systems aren't all about how effective they are in real life. Tai Chi is a way of life. It's about that inward journey as much as the outward. Harmony, visualization, mind and body connection. This aspect of martial arts is often lost on things like boxing or wrestling, where the focus is purely on performance. And maybe that's a bad thing. Krav Maga. Whilst the Nazis advanced through Europe during the 1930s and spread their anti-Semitic violence, Jewish communities in Slovakia began to be attacked. It's a black stain in our history books as a civilization, but out of this turbulence, a new martial art was taking root. Imi Lichtenfeld, a man in his 20s and a successful boxer and wrestler in his own right, distraught by the unrest, took it upon himself to start defending those in his Jewish community by giving lessons on self-defense and using his knowledge of the aforementioned art forms, although it quickly became obvious to him that these techniques, based in a sport with steadfast rules, wasn't exactly applicable to the streets, where anything goes and weapons can be used also. He needed to develop his techniques for real-world violent scenarios, and so during this horrific time, he set about creating a new system, a new form of martial art, something that would later be known as Krav Maga. As the war progressed, there was no option for Imi and those in his Jewish community but to flee out of the occupied country. He would make a new home in Palestine. There he would quickly join a Jewish paramilitary organization known as Haganah. This ragtag bunch of inexperienced military men needed some kind of formal base of combat training, and so like he did for his community back in his homeland, he began once again training up these men in his self-defense system. Now with warfare implications, this meant that Krav Maga exponentially expanded its toolkit and techniques. Whilst Krav Maga was a rather rough around the edges system during this time of unrest, the formal establishment of his system began to be laid out during the late 1940s and early 1950s after the Second World War, where Lichtenfeld had been appointed chief instructor for physical fitness with the Israeli Defense Force, or the IDF, which had been founded during Israel's war for independence in 1948. Over the next 2 decades, He refined the techniques and principles of Krav Maga to suit the needs for the IDF, with a real focus on hand-to-hand combat scenarios in a military setting. After retiring from the IDF in the 70s, after serving for more than 20 years, Lichtenfeld started adapting Krav Maga for civilian use. He opened training centers in Israel and began certifying instructors to teach Krav Maga internationally, and from there it would explode in popularity. As stated before, Krav incorporates various combinations of the best and most practical techniques from boxing, wrestling, Aikido, Judo, BJJ and Karate, but it is distinct in its focus on real-world violent situations, with a primary function on providing the necessary skills to defend themselves against various threats, including armed and unarmed attacks. What gets spat out the other side of this need is a rather unique and technical-looking system of defense. Krav Maga emphasizes neutralizing threats as quickly and efficiently as possible. Just imagine you are Tom Cruise from Jack Reacher, and that's the goal here. People often joke something along the lines of BJJ, choke the suspect out, Krav Maga, stab him in the face with a screwdriver. Practitioners are trained to remain aware of their surroundings, to identify potential threats early, and react accordingly. There is also a particular emphasis on simultaneous defense and offense, because like Charles Xavier said in X-Men, the best defense is a good offense. Krav Maga will take practitioners of the system to all areas of where combat can take place, whether that is fighting on the ground using chokes and strikes, or using range with kicks and weapons. Once techniques have been established, they will then be put to the test in high-stress simulations, with the intent to condition students' mental resolve under pressure, something that you can imagine is extremely useful for those potentially having to go to war and using these techniques, which plays into a fundamental part of the system as well. The techniques have been developed to align with people's natural reactions to violent stimuli. For example, someone coming at you with a knife, and you might be inclined to put up your hands or forearms to initially defend yourself. So the system plays into this lizard brain reaction and then develops from it. There is, however, one slight problem that has arisen though, and that is, with the popularity of the system that has significantly increased around the world, its efficacy as a martial arts system has started to fall apart, leading to a lot of skepticism to its practicality in recent years. Schools started teaching unrealistic techniques, or even if they did use the correct techniques, would take them far out of context and then put them in choreographed scenarios. These rogue instructors are more than likely not qualified or experienced experts and have hijacked the essence of Krav Maga. I guess it is now used as a marketing gimmick by large groups of heretics. Fully resistant training and sparring is essential to the core of this martial art, and if an instructor or gym is not doing so, then more than likely you are creeping into the world of Bushido. The real Krav Maga, however, like you'll find used by those in the IDF to this day, is a great system for self-defense, and very brutal if used correctly.
What about Krav Maga? Is that any good?
Sure, yeah.
All right, you don't hear much about Krav.
Well, it's a combination. It's a self-defense system. But what it essentially is the best aspects of all these different martial arts, like a Jeet Kune Do, like a Jewish Jeet Kune Do. Like
Sambo and combat Sambo.
Who cares, brother? Who cares? Today, smash.
These were two different entries on the iceberg, but I've put them together for brevity's sake, and it makes sense to place this one below Krav Maga also, as their origins as military systems means that they have a few similarities. And so now we enter the world of Habib and Islam, the Sambo men who crushed the entirety of the UFC, utilizing their extensive background in combat Sambo, something that was instilled in them by Habib's father and the late great coach Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov. Sambo, and an acronym derived from the Russian phrase that you can see on screen now, because there ain't no way I can pronounce that, means in English, self-defense without weapons. I mean, how much more self-explanatory can you get? And if it wasn't obvious where this is going, then hold on to your bootstraps, because oh boy, it's time for some Soviet-Russian military time. In the early 1920s, the Soviet Union sought to create a standardized hand-to-hand combat system for its military and law enforcement personnel. Two men, pioneers of the sport, Spiridonov and Oshchepkov, were, I'm sure, very politely asked by the government to create such a system, and so off they went, working independently on their own interpretation of what would eventually become Sambo. Spiridonov's approach was more methodical and theoretical, whilst Oshchepkov was more practical and focused on live sparring and application. They combined the two, and Sambo arose from the melting pot of martial arts. After a while of being used by the military, it actually ended up being recognized as an official sport by the Soviet Union, where basic rules about what can be worn and what constitutes paths to victory was established. Sambo spent a lot of its time under wraps, in a very secretive and closed-off world in Soviet Russia. But over time, the sport started to gain traction, especially on the Asian and European continents. And so in 1973, Sambo managed to actually pull off its first ever world championship competition. I mean, not all the world showed up, and Soviet Russia won, of course. I mean, I don't know what you were expecting. I mean, if we're being real, they don't actually ever stop winning this. Rather unfair, really. But still, it meant that the sport was growing and aiming for legitimacy. By the mid-1980s, the rules would be codified and standardized, and even the Olympics acknowledged it as an amateur wrestling sport, although they have yet to actually allow it into the Olympics itself. Sport Sambo's rules are very similar to judo in a sense. A Sambo wrestling match can be won in one of 3 different ways: by total victory, a perfect throw or submission hold, by technical superiority, which is achieved by getting a 12-point lead in the score, or by point difference at the end of the match. Throws, trips, slams, locks, and submissions are all allowed, similar to the old-style judo rules. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Sambo has managed to actually spread its influence globally, and countries such as Bulgaria, Mongolia, Japan, and the United States wanted to get in on some of the action, have actually opened up schools and clubs to get people trained up for national competitions. So really, it's only a matter of time before other countries start displaying their proficiency in MMA. As we have seen in the last decade or so, those with a Sambo background have had quite a significant impact on the martial arts landscape. Those Russian pioneers who have bulldozed through the UFC rankings have shown that this might actually be the meta at the moment. A shame really that it requires steamy hot bath times together. Combat Sambo, whilst listed separately from Sambo itself, is just an offshoot of what I've explained already, except that it resembles a lot of what we see in mixed martial arts today, such as punches, kicks, elbows, knees, and headbutts, and well, apparently groin strikes as well, according to this. When in Russia, I suppose. Competitors during competitions will also wear the same jackets that we see in Sport Sambo, but also other protections such as gloves, shin guards, and headgear. Kendo. Kendo translates to the way of the sword, and as the name suggests, this martial art formed from the ashes of the ancient samurai. The samurai's favoured weapon during the feudal period in Japan was the katana, though they were proficient with spears and archery also. Samurai, however, were around for over 1,000 years before the Edo period began, which is the 17th century. They were warriors and displayed their skill and bloodshed on the battlefield, known for their honour, discipline, and true warrior code, the Bushido code that is. But by the 1600s, a more peaceful time had befallen the beautiful lands of Japan, and with that peace, the samurai class would shift roles from that of spilling blood and violent protection of their lords to more clerical and diplomatic ones. With less need for actual combat, Kenjutsu, the all-encompassing art form for the samurai, began to emphasize discipline, character building, and spiritual development. Training would ultimately become more formalized and structured. Bamboo swords and protective gear became popular for training, much like judo and other Japanese martial arts. All techniques are developed through kata and kumite. In the 19th century, even more political change meant that the samurai class were abolished, and around this time, Kenjutsu shifted to be called Kendo instead, and also began to be taught in Japanese schools as a part of a curriculum. This led to great popularity, and eventually it being recognized as a sport in the country. Kendo differs from other combat sports such as wrestling and judo. In Kendo, there are no classes that separate competitors by weight or size. Players compete using bamboo swords to try and strike the protective gear of opponents in set target areas. Players score points by decisively striking these targets. The sport resembles fencing in a lot of ways, just very stylized, as you can imagine. I mean, it did come from the samurai after all. Matches are fast-paced, with competitors looking to score points by finding a gap or opening to strike, deflecting and attacking, or initiating an attack to create an opening by disrupting an opponent. Kendo competitions are typically held indoors, although they can be done outside as well on open ground. Often these matches are held on the grounds of a shrine or a temple. Etiquette and respect are central to Kendo practice. Practitioners bow to each other, their instructors, and the dojo, reflecting the deep sense of respect and humility ingrained in the art. Wing Chun, also known as Wing Sun and Wing Sun, is the youngest form of Kung Fu which we had described in the previous tier. It was, according to folklore legend, established in the Qing dynasty, and that's 1644 and 1912 for those who aren't nerds out there. Ying Mui, an elder and a Buddhist who had survived the destruction of her Shaolin temple at the hands of the Qing government, was seeking to establish a martial art that could be learned quickly and also be effective for smaller, weaker practitioners. Ing Mui allegedly devised a system based on her observation of a fight between a stork and a large rodent, where the stork was able to kill the rodent by using its wings and legs to attack and defend simultaneously, which you can kind of see translated to when practitioners of this sport spar with the wooden dummy. She named her new style Wing Chun, which also translates to Everlasting Springtime, which was the name of one of her best students who had used the system to defend herself against a creepy warlord who wanted to shag and bag her. Her name was Yim Wing Chun. Yim Wing Chun later taught her husband, and from there he would start a long lineage of mentorship and studentship, which leads into a tradition of this sport that only one master could teach one devout student at a time, meaning that this martial arts system grew extremely slow. The other problem was that it was taught in person, nothing was ever written down, and this was an attempt to hide it from the government. Almost to its downfall, Wing Chun continued to be handed down to only one person at a time, a lineage that would lead all the way to the famous Yip Man, a Chinese man born in 1883, who went on to become a legend in martial arts circles. And I think that you've all more than likely seen the incredible movie fronted by Donnie Yen, which recounts the early life of Yip Man. Although slightly embellished, it's an incredible story that gives some good context to that time in China. It is said that if it wasn't for Grandmaster Yip Man, Wing Chun would have more than likely been snuffed out due to the Chinese Cultural Revolution that was going on at the time, which, if you don't know, was a rather brutal period of Chinese history. Thankfully, Yip Man migrated to Hong Kong in the mid-1900s, and from there would present to the public Wing Chun. Yip Man's teaching methods and charismatic personality would amass a good-sized group of students, many of whom would become notable martial artists in their own right. Yip Man's efforts helped to standardize Wing Chun techniques and training methods, establishing a clear lineage and structure for the art. One of Yip Man's most famous students was Bruce Lee, who had started his training with Yip Man in the 1950s, although Lee would later go on to develop his own martial arts system, Jeet Kune Do, which we will get onto later. It always paid homage to Wing Chun and its influence in his life, which would bring significant attention to the art form. And with Bruce Lee's international fame and all, as you can imagine, a bunch of fat Westerners started punching wooden dummies. So what exactly is Wing Chun from a physical standpoint? Well, it is characterized by rapid, successive punches aimed at overwhelming an opponent. These strikes are very direct, and then the defense of strikes with the legs and hands at the same time is also very stylized. The aim ultimately is to redirect opponents' energy and off-balance them. All of this is done by working off the center line of the opponent. Wing Chun is a close-quarter style martial arts system. It differed greatly from other Kung Fu styles at the time, as it wasn't based on imitation of animals or movements, but rather focused on direct, efficient movements. There is also an emphasis on Qi or energy, attuned through relaxed, soft training methods. The stance and directness of strikes is probably the most notable thing about this style. You can probably cast your minds back to my favorite fight of all time, which is Tony Ferguson versus Anthony Pettis. In that fight, we would actually see Wing Chun get displayed in the cage effectively.
You very rarely see that in the UFC, but one of the best fighters in the UFC uses it regularly. Tony Ferguson. Tony Ferguson uses trapping hands.
The Mukjung.
Yeah.
Overall though, Wing Chun is a great martial art for developing many great health benefits. Capoeira. Capoeira is an Afro-Brazilian martial art disguised as a dance and performed to the glorious sound of music. It is comprised of specific offensive and defensive movements, and dissimilar to other martial arts in the fact that the practitioner is always moving thanks to a fundamental technique, the ginga. The ginga is a unique back and forth dance-like movement that is done at all times. The movements in this martial arts system also consist of positions on the ground, kicks, sweeps, and acrobatics. We have seen this perhaps most famously played out by one of my favorite fighters to watch, Michel Pereira, who, displays that beautiful capoeira style with a few bonus backflips chucked in for flavor. Conor McGregor was quite famously influenced in some of his movements by capoeira also.
Playing touch butt with that dork in the park.
Capoeira's origins can be traced back to the 16th century, during the transatlantic slave trade, where Portuguese colonists began to bring African slaves over to Brazil, brought there to work on plantations cutting sugarcane. These diverse African people brought along with them from their homeland many traditions, and that included their music and their combat sports. Out of this mingling of different African cultures emerged capoeira, a martial arts system that was hidden under the guise of ritualistic dance. Unbeknownst to their oppressors, these men and women were learning the art of combat in case escape ever presented itself. Slavery would go on to be abolished in 1888, although, as we know, their discrimination endured past this legislation, and now free and able to travel, capoeira made its way to the cities, where unfortunately, it grew to be associated with gangs, violence, and criminals. In the late 19th century, the Brazilian government banned the practice of capoeira as it was seen as a threat to the police and the country, suspecting more than likely a coup of highly trained ass-kickers, spinning hook-kicking racists in the face. Capoeira practitioners, if caught, actually faced imprisonment. Obviously, like anything you ban, it ties its people closer together and it grows stronger in influence. And so it began to be conducted in secret. After decades of it being oppressed, the government, which was undergoing reforms, finally relented and recognized capoeira as a national sport, lifting the ban in 1937 and allowing people to openly practice this game and pseudo-martial art. Capoeira was eventually structured and made more systematic, with a formal curriculum. From there, it has spread its influence globally at this point, with schools and groups cropping up in many different countries. Capoeira is a fast and versatile martial art. The ginga is the fundamental movement in capoeira, important both for attack and defense purposes. It has two main objectives. One is to keep the capoeira practitioner in a state of constant motion, preventing him or her being a still and easy target. The other is that it is almost like a trance, fakes and feints. It is to mislead, fool and trick the opponent, leaving them open for attack or counterattack. Capoeira is practiced in a roda circle where two capoeirists engage in a playful and strategic game, accompanied by traditional music and songs. The music is integral to capoeira, setting the rhythm and guiding the movements. Capoeira movements are characterized by fluid, acrobatic and rhythmic techniques, including kicks, sweeps, spins, and evasions. Practitioners strive to outmaneuver and outwit their opponents through agility, creativity, and strategy. It's not really a sport with a decisive victory in mind, or even to hurt your dance partner. It's more of an aggressive game, where people can get hurt, but it is not the main point. It is more about highlighting skill and technique, but beyond it being a game, it's a ritual with deep cultural roots. With the struggle of slavery and colonization in mind, players call an end to the ritual or game when one of them feels that they have proven their proficiency, or they feel that they have outwitted the other. Eskrima, which also goes by two other names used interchangeably, arnis and kale, is a traditional Filipino martial art that emphasizes the use of sticks, knives, and other bladed weapons. With the global expansion of this sport, different styles and nuances of eskrima have emerged, some that concentrate on the sporting element, some on particular weapons or sticks, and some that try to implement eskrima in a more self-defense based way. And so you might have heard of the term FMA, which stands for Filipino Martial Arts. FMA basically takes all of these different variations and puts them under one umbrella. For the sake of this video, we are just going to go ahead and call it eskrima. But to be clear, eskrima is officially documented by the powers that be as an indigenous Filipino martial art and sport, characterized by the use of swinging and thrusting movements, accompanied by striking, thrusting, and powering techniques for defense and offense. Whilst eskrima is perhaps most famous for the use of kale sticks, this martial arts system also includes the training in knives, machetes, staffs, and even things like an axe. The training in these is meant to be taught in such a way that techniques can be translated interchangeably between different weapon systems. The reason why eskrima has such an emphasis on variety of weapons is because the sport was born out of a need for indigenous people of the Philippines not only to defend themselves between warring tribes, but also hunting. For this reason, eskrima has a legitimate claim to be a useful self-defense weapon system, although, like Krav Maga, some rogue instructors in modern times have begun to muddy the water a little, which has drawn in a lot of criticism. And when I say a lot, I mean a lot. The main problem that I can see is that there is no governing body, no legislated awarding body for instructors. All this in spite of the fact that in the late 19th century, with the country undergoing American and Japanese occupations, eskrima began to be systemized with proper schools and curriculums. The problem is that with its expansion, The proper way of teaching waned. This hasn't stopped a lot of the very best techniques being used in military and law enforcement, however, in particular the close quarter combat styling and use of Calais sticks, which obviously translates very well to police batons. The Eskrima sporting system adopts a lot of what things like fencing and kendo do. Practitioners will be geared up in full body protection systems, given a padded stick, and then attempt to smack the shit out of each other, gaining points for hitting particular parts of the body. Because this martial art has explored a lot of what we have seen with the previous 2 tiers, I think with the footage shown and what I've explained, you kind of get a good idea of what Eskrima is. So let's get our asses over to Tier 3. Welcome to Tier 3. Now things start to get a little more obscure, and hints of fake martial arts start seeping in. Everyone knows the legend and pioneer of martial arts Bruce Lee, an icon in his own right. But did you know that he actually formed and created his own martial art? The Martial Artsopedia describes his system as such. Jeet Kune Do, also known as JKD, is a hybrid martial arts system and life philosophy founded by martial artist Bruce Lee, with direct, non-classical, and straightforward movements. Due to the way that his style works, they believe in minimal movement with maximum effect and extreme speed. The system works on the use of different tools for different situations. These situations are broken down into ranges: kicking, punching, trapping, and grappling, with techniques flowing smoothly between them. It is referred to as the style without style. Unlike more traditional martial arts, Jeet Kune Do is not fixed or patterned, and is a philosophy with guiding thoughts. It was named for the concept of interception, or attacking your opponent while he is about to attack. However, the name Jeet Kune Do was often said by Bruce Lee to be just a name. He himself often referred to it as the art of expressing the human body. Bruce came to believe that styles had become too rigid and unrealistic. He called martial art competitions of the day dry land swimming. He believed that combat was spontaneous and that a martial artist cannot predict it, only react to it, and that a good martial artist should be like water and move fluidly without hesitation.
You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
Jeet Kune Do has been most influenced by Wing Chun, Tai Chi, Taekwondo, boxing, fencing, and Jiu-Jitsu. My favorite MMA fighter that claims a background from Jeet Kune Do is the legendary and often forgot veteran Tim Boetsch. And remember, my friends, be like water. Savate. Savate has its origins nestled in the boozy streets of France, in particular the harbour areas where sailors, military men, and locals would scrap it out on the cheese and baguette-infused cobblestones. One of the more popular theories of the origins of Savate, which translates to old shoe, is that of the time of Napoleon Bonaparte, whom soldiers would kick the behinds of prisoners. So what does old shoes and drunk sailors have to do with this unique martial art? Well, as you can see from this footage, Savate has now formalized itself into a sport that has opponents kick each other and box each other, whilst you can certainly see influences from kickboxing or boxing itself. The main rule of Savate is that striking with the legs can only land with the foot or the shoe. See, Savate practitioners will wear a padded shoe, which is used to land on the opponent. No shin or knee strikes are allowed. Striking with the hands is allowed, however, but because no clinching is allowed, range is the greatest weapon to be used. Hitting the opponent from afar with the feet or jabs is preferred. The major concept in Savate, much like Mr. Beast, is touching without being touched, or rather, kicking a fellow Frenchman in the face without getting smashed yourself. You will see many Savate practitioners be very nimble and elusive, their footwork and kicks impeccable. With such an emphasis on striking with the foot alone, leads to people who train in this martial art being just extraordinary at using range. I'll overlay some footage here of a Savate guy going up against a Muay Thai practitioner, and you can see just how wonderfully the Savate guy deals with more well-known martial art. There are a lot of teeps and inside leg kicks to be thrown at the opponent that catches the opponent off guard. It goes to show that with a few rule changes, just how different and unique the kicks can become with a sport. Savate is certainly very stylized. You'll probably remember Gerard Gordeau famously entering the UFC 1 tournament and booting that massive fat guy in the face. What stood out about Gerard Gordeau was his incredibly versatile kicks. Owing directly to his time competing in Savate, Gerard Gordeau would go on to make it all the way to the finals before being submitted by Royce Gracie. Savate is now practiced worldwide after being codified and accepted as a genuine sport and not just some form of self-defense in street fights. Systema. As we traverse this iceberg to its most mind-bogglingly murky depths, you'll begin to see a pattern emerge of crazy Russian people making up strange forms of martial arts. The first on this list is that of Systema, something that you have more than likely heard of or been exposed to in your time. Born out of the collapse of the Soviet Union, Systema became more widely practiced. The word Systema simply comes from the word systems of self-defense that is. While Systema is the colloquial term for all martial arts in this bracket, systems themselves were often, in most cases, named after the teacher. Systems were just a hodgepodge of different forms of martial arts and training, from hand-to-hand combat, grappling, to the use of knives, guns, and, well, any weapon really. Systema, due to its rather large spread and variation in terms of what was taught and how, has drew a lot of criticisms, where some schools are very specific and traditional in their teachings, others border on the Bushido side of things, and that's where you've probably seen the videos of crazy Russian people doing ridiculous things in the name of martial arts. A lot of historians want to paint Systema as something that has come from an incredible background, namely people claiming that when the Soviet Union took over, they suppressed all forms of traditional martial arts in their rule, deciding instead to only teach combat in the special forces, something akin to Krav Maga that we saw earlier in the iceberg. And it was only after the Soviet Union's collapse did this system leak back into the public. But I think it's fairly obvious to anyone that those who proclaim this stuff that you are seeing on screen now is taught to people who genuinely have to kill other people is an insane prospect. Thus, Systema is left to ridicule for the most part, but as I say, that doesn't mean that there aren't some systems out there that teach very real martial arts. It's just all the others that tar the name of Systema. There is a Reddit post here where someone asks why don't people take it seriously, and the reply from one of the Redditors basically sums it up. If you want to pause and have a read, it explains a bit further. Is Systema misunderstood? Probably. But there is just so much better alternatives out there, and that will always be the major problem. And there is zero reliability that you aren't walking into some wacko's dojo when you are signing up for Systema. Shotokan and Kyokushin. These were actually two different entries on this tier in the iceberg, but I think it's important that we group them together for this discussion so that I don't have to repeat myself so much. These are two different forms of karate. Shotokan is the most popular form of karate which we have previously discussed. It is credited with being the form that popularized karate back in the early 1900s. The father and son, who were the founders of this form of karate, used to do public demonstrations and teachings in university, which led to many clubs being formed, and thus the explosion of karate into the mainstream. There isn't much to be said beyond this that hasn't already been said in the tier below. Perhaps the most famous person that we know with a solid background in Shotokan is Henry Cejudo, who uses that very traditional and noticeable karate stance. Kyokushin, on the other hand, is a style of karate that focuses more on kumite, or the full contact sparring part of karate. Some people say that Kyokushin is a very brutal form of karate and misses the point of the spiritual and health development aspects that something like Shotokan might instead favor. It's a very heated debate, but as a general rule, this is the difference between the two. Aido. Aido has been recorded back as far as the 1500s. It is a Japanese traditional martial art to its very core. Aido is recognized as an intrinsic part of the wider Budo code. Aido is a martial art of awareness, of being present, attuned with nature, humans, and your surroundings. After all, the samurai who practiced the way of the sword should never be taken by surprise in warfare, something that Musashi would most definitely preach. Aido therefore puts strong emphasis on the capability of drawing one sword as quickly and effectively as possible, responding to any and all potential attacks. Aido consists of four main components: the smooth, controlled movements of drawing the sword from its scabbard, striking or cutting an opponent, shaking blood from the blade, and replacing the sword in the scabbard. You'll see that newcomers of this swordsmanship art form will start with a wooden version of the blade, and then work their way up to the real thing with time and dedication. Aido forms a small part of the Budo system of the samurai and Japanese warriors, a way of life for some. Aido is a non-combative art form that mainly focuses on the inward journey. It is actually a sport as well. People are scored on performing their kata next to each other. The winners determined by their performance with the blade. Bare knuckle boxing.
Joe Rogan, I'm making this tape for your face and for your body. Come on, Joe! Knock you clean out across the fucking river. Huh? I hope you can swim, Joe.
The early days of boxing, as we discussed at the very start of this entry on the iceberg, started without any padded protection. and then developed from there. But there has always been bare knuckle boxing alongside it, even though traditional boxing went on its own course. Bare knuckle was considered a lot more raw and brutal than that of those who did it with gloves, but the fact that the gloves are not worn means that tactics and techniques change, like blocking has to be done differently because that extra surface area isn't there. Because we discussed boxing in the previous entry, I thought that I'd just lay out the rules for the most famous bare knuckle organisation, that of Conor McGregor's BKFC. The rules are as follows. Fighters are permitted to wrap and tape the wrist, thumb and mid-hand. No gauze or tape can be used within 1 inch of the knuckles. Fighters will toe the line. There are 2 lines, 3 feet apart in the centre of the ring, where the fighters will stand each round. The front foot will be on the line, and the referee will instruct the fighters to knuckle up. This indicates the beginning of the round. Punches are the only strikes allowed and must be closed fist. In the clinch, the fighter may punch his way out with an open hand. If there is a 3-second lull in the action whilst clinching, the referee will break up the fight. If a fighter is knocked down, he will have 10 seconds to return to his feet, or the referee will stop the fight. You are not permitted to hit a down fighter. If you do, you'll be disqualified, and your purse will be withheld. Whilst a fighter is down, the other fighter will be instructed to report to a neutral space. If a fighter is cut and the blood is impairing the fighter's vision, the referee may call a timeout to give a cut man 30 seconds to stop the bleeding. If the blood cannot be controlled and the blood inhibits the fighter's vision, the referee will stop the fight and award victory to the other fighter. Fights are 2 minutes per round, and each bout will be 5 rounds in length. And the last rule is, all fighters are expected to give 100% effort and behave with complete sportsmanship. If you have managed to catch a BKFC event, then you will know that it is actually a very interesting and entertaining sport, if not extremely bloody. So I highly recommend checking it out if you have the chance. Hapkido. Its roots can be traced back to the start of the 20th century, where the founder of the sport, Choi Hung-sul, a Korean man who was sent to Japan during the occupation of his country. There, he would learn a wide range of martial arts in that country. When he was eventually sent back to Korea in his adulthood, he would begin the teaching of his new amalgamation art form, Hapkido. There is a lot of similarities with Aikido, where Aikido is a bit impractical, focusing on energy. Hapkido, on the other hand, utilizes genuine techniques such as strikes, throws, locks, and weaponry, but from a spiritual standpoint, has a similar theme of harmony and redirecting energy as Aikido. So if you will, Hapkido is a sport that is essentially a better, more useful form of Aikido. I know some people are going to get butthurt about that comment. One thing that struck me in researching this is the kind of cult-like following this martial art has. I scrolled through countless pages on the internet during the research of this almost 3-hour-long video, and I mean, you look at the Wikipedia page for it, and almost 70% of the Wikipedia page for Hapkido is dedicated to the personalities of the martial art, which, trust me, is super uncommon and super weird. It tells me that there is more than likely an element of bullshido going on here. Something is just a bit off about it all. Anyway, there we have it. Hapkido, an amalgamation art form with a cult-like following. Bartitsu. Bartitsu is a martial art and self-defense method developed in England between 1898 and 1902 by Edward William Barton Wright. It gained its fame when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle referenced it in his 1903 Sherlock Holmes story, where instead of falling to his death at the Reichenbach Falls, he instead used this martial art to defend himself against Moriarty. Although it faded during the 20th century, Bartitsu was revived in 2002, presumably by hipsters. Barton Wright, inspired by his time in Japan, created Bartitsu by blending fighting styles he had studied, including jujutsu, judo, boxing, savate, and stick fighting. It also featured a physical fitness regimen. The art form itself is rather unique, and so where better to get our information from than the man himself, Barton Wright. This is from an excerpt that was taken from one of his lectures that he conducted in Japan in 1901. Bartitsu included boxing, or the use of the fist as a hitting medium, the use of the feet in both an offensive and defensive sense, the use of a walking stick as a mean of self-defense. Judo and Jiu-Jitsu, which are secret styles of Japanese wrestling, would call close play as applied to self-defense in order to ensure, as far as it is possible, immunity against injury in cowardly attacks or quarrels. One must understand boxing in order to thoroughly appreciate the danger and rapidity of a well-directed blow and the particular parts of the body which are scientifically attacked. The same, of course, applies to the use of the foot or stick. Judo and Jiu-Jitsu were not designed as primary means of attack and defense against a boxer or a man who kicks you, but only to be used after coming to close quarters, and in order to get to close quarters, it is absolutely necessary to understand boxing and the use of the foot and the stick. Barton Wright, convinced of his genius of creating this rather exotic and collective martial art, opened a club in London for wealthy men to practice this emerging creation. But within a couple of years, the club would close and Bartitsu would fall by the wayside. Too expensive club fees were listed as the reason, and the fact that wealthy men really didn't give a shit about Barton Wright's creation. But what we do get from this martial art is some unique Sherlock Holmes lore. American Kempo. I'm sure that you've heard of the almighty American Kempo. Its displays of unparalleled aggression and speed that leaves its opponents motionless, stuck in the mud from fear. American Kempo comes from the mind of Ed Parker, an Hawaiian man who molded more traditional Kempo into a more effective art form. Ed Parker was a black belt in judo and also trained in boxing before creating his rather deadly form of combat. The main focus, as you can see, of Kempo is to use speed and a sequence of insane techniques and strikes to disable an attacker, but I think that the only thing being disabled or attacked is my brain cells, and therein lies the age-old back and forth of those who understand Kempo and those who don't. Unfortunately, I am one of those who does not understand Kempo in the slightest. Kempo does seem to be one of them martial arts with a very cult-like following. I mean, it even has a creed. I come to you with only karate. I have no weapons, but should I be forced to defend myself, my principles, or my honor, should it be a matter of life or death, or right and wrong, then here are my weapons. Karate, my empty hands. Emphasizing low kicks for balance and speed, American Kempo prioritizes environmental awareness, stability, and timing as students progress. It values understandings of concepts over memorization, encouraging practitioners to adapt techniques to their needs rather than mimic set motions. Ed Parker designed Kempo as an evolving combat science where individuals' effectiveness depends on correctly applying the principles taught. American Kempo can use weapons such as the Kali sticks, but also takes into account many different martial arts forms in its own system, such as karate, judo, jujutsu, and boxing. So whilst the footage you see of people being crazily attacked, there is a good base of traditional martial arts in there somewhere. So let's get the obvious out the way. Practitioners of Kempo know full well that their live demonstrations, where they land 500 punches before an opponent reacts, is completely unrealistic. They call these demonstrations ideal demonstrations. They also account for things not going that way and have 4 stages of delivering the systems, ranging from ideal, perhaps what you have been exposed to the most, all the way to not so ideal, because they don't really do full resistance sparring, which is the main problem with American Kempo, I suppose. So even for people like me, who clearly don't like this style of martial art, it does make sense what Ed Parker is saying here. It's about getting a foundation and then using elements to defend yourself with thereafter. I don't know if people have said this before. When you have taught someone a specific set of movements, when they are confronted with real danger, are they actually going to instinctively take something from one movement pattern and one from another different movement pattern, all without thinking whilst being attacked? I really think in that situation that they won't. American Kempo has essentially zero emphasis on live sparring. Despite all its criticisms for being a functional martial art, Chuck Liddell, our boy and vet of the UFC, has a background in Kempo. Obviously, he doesn't punch someone in the throat 3,000 times in a minute like those in American Kempo, but clearly it had some effective influence on him, so there must be something there. Ultimately, Kempo provides a structure and a system into self-defense, but it shouldn't be relied on. I think it's always important to remember, as we go deeper into this iceberg, that the Bushido stuff and the quirky martial arts systems start to creep up. These martial arts aren't always used for physical violence. Sometimes they are just workouts, health benefits for people, and American Kempo is certainly that, a club for people who want to learn basics, get fitter and healthier, and there's nothing wrong with that. Sumo. Sumo is considered to be Japan's oldest sport, over 1,500 years old to be precise. The sport is fairly simple to understand. 2 opponents dressed in Gollum cosplay stand in a clay ring that measures to be about 4.5 meters wide. The objective, I hear you ask? Well, to get the other guy out of the ring, of course, by pushing him around, or as an alternative form of victory, to get your opponent to touch the floor with anything other than the soles of his feet. Slapping is permitted, along with slamming, locking of limbs, redirecting, tripping, throwing, or grabbing the loincloth. There is no time limit and rounds go until someone loses. I guess my first real exposure to this sport beyond just seeing it in movies or TV shows was that YouTube video of the diet of a sumo wrestler. It's extremely eye-opening to see the dedication these men have to putting on size and mass in order to be more effective athletes in this rather unique sport. My favourite part of sumo is the pre-fight rituals that are obviously quite famous. First, the fighter cleanses their mouths, then throws salt to purify the ring, and then my favourite, stamping out all of them evil spirits. The sport of sumo is most often conducted in tournaments, which take place over 15 days. The winner is determined by who has the most wins. Sumo is also ranked just like boxing and MMA, and people are divided into different divisions based on ability and merit. Wrestlers enter sumo in the lowest Jonokuchi division, and ability permitting work their way up to the top division. A broad demarcation in the sumo world can be seen between the wrestlers in the top 2 divisions, known as the Sekitori, and those in the 4 lower divisions, known commonly by their more generic term, Rikishi. The ranks receive different levels of compensation and privileges and status. For those wondering, sumo competitors in the top division receive around £250,000 a year in salary, and then can go on to win money as winners of tournaments, which can net them as much as $100,000. The world of sumo is incredibly rich in culture, style, and tradition, and it is honestly a great sport to actually watch. It was great researching this one. Stamp them evil spirits out, people. Ninjutsu. So let's talk about ninjas for a second. Ninjutsu was developed as a collection of fundamental survivalist techniques in the warring state of feudal Japan, but spying, as a general rule of thumb, has been around for over 1,500 years in Japan. The ninja used their art to ensure their survival in a time of violent political turmoil. Ninjutsu included methods of gathering information and techniques of non-detection, avoidance, and misdirection. Ninjutsu involved training in disguise, escape, concealment, archery, and medicine. Skills relating to espionage and assassination were highly useful to warring factions in feudal Japan. At some point, the skills of espionage became known collectively as shinobi no jutsu. The problem with ninjutsu is that it has since been taken hostage by the world of Bushido, the most famous of which is the legendary Ashida Kim, the American ninja. According to him, and Napoleon Bonaparte's dissection of his bullshit, traveled the world learning the sacred craft of the ninja. Ashida Kim essentially produced a load of ninja cosplay videos disguising his mockery of the craft as an official ninjutsu deadly technique system to the world, and unfortunately did this to great success. And so if you wondered what it takes to levitate like ninjutsu master Ashida Kim, then perhaps pick up his autobiography. I'm sure it's really good. The story of Ashida Kim and other ninjutsu experts is rather hilarious, and I highly recommend heading over to Napoleon Bonaparte's video on it. It's great stuff. Anyway, there are some people who try to run serious ninjutsu classes, but like most Bushido subcategories, they are just other martial arts dressed up to make people think that they are becoming ninjas. Hung Gar. Hung Gar is one of the more prominent forms of Kung Fu that has come from southern China. This Kung Fu style incorporates both external and internal methods. Hung Gar has a particular emphasis on strong stances, long and short hand techniques, which encompasses straight, circular, and angular movements. The intent is to develop efficiency of movement as well as coordination. The result is superior inside maneuvers, none more evident than the variations of kicks, mostly executed below the waist. Although the execution of movement appears to be hard, this system, in fact, incorporates both hard and soft techniques in a multitude of directions. The execution of advanced techniques is complex. Research has determined that Hung Gar possesses more intricate hand techniques and stance maneuvers than any other traditional system from China. Because it is also an internal system, it boasts many health benefits. Hung Gar's earliest beginnings have been traced to the 17th century in southern China. Hung Gar is something that you have undoubtedly been exposed to, in particular the styling of the tiger and crane. For me, it is something that I used to mimic doing in the playground as a child. Little did I know that it is a very popular offshoot of Kung Fu. Obviously, a lot of that we have spoken about previously, so now we move on to Li Gar. In the original iceberg, this is actually in the tier above, so I've decided to move it down here so that I'm not repeating myself too much. Li Gar is just another Chinese martial arts system, much like Hung Gar. Li Gar differentiates itself by blending of the hard, stable southern fist and the quick agility of the northern schools. This style is most famous for its use of the long staff and leg kicks. Everything remains similar to what we've discussed before with southern Chinese martial arts. Choi Li Fu. This is another traditional Chinese martial art that combines the techniques and philosophies of various southern and northern Chinese Kung Fu styles, founded in the 19th century by Chan Hong, who was taught by a Li Ga specialist who happened to be his uncle. He used this foundation to develop Choi Li Fu. Choi Li Fu is known for its powerful strikes, dynamic movements, and a wide range of techniques, making it one of the most versatile and effective forms of traditional Chinese martial arts. The style emphasizes fluid, circular movements that generate power from the entire body. Techniques often involve swinging punches and large arm movements that are not only powerful, but also difficult to predict or blocked. In addition to its hand techniques, Choi Li Fu incorporates a variety of kicks and sweeping movements that can be used to off-balance or take down an opponent. Much like other Shaolin and Kung Fu, it integrates animal forms such as the tiger, dragon, crane, and snake. Choi Li Fu also includes training with traditional Chinese weapons such as the staff, broadsword, spear, and butterfly knives. Weapons training enhances coordination, strength, and understanding of distance and timing. Sanda. Taking its roots from a bunch of martial arts that have already been mentioned before, Sanda is a combat sports system developed by the Chinese government to be taught in the form of a curriculum. It's a very structured and scientific approach to martial arts, taking all the best aspects of traditional Chinese martial arts and also borrowing from others developed around the world, such as boxing, kickboxing, and judo. The curriculum is shown on screen now, and shows all the things that are taught as a part of this system. Originally, Sanda was developed for the Chinese military, the effectiveness of which was proven in the field, and the government then felt that its citizens should also be trained in this amorphous martial art. Sanda has a lot in common with what we have discussed with Wushu and Kung Fu. Some famous martial arts fighters who owe some of their background to Sanda are the likes of Zhang Weili and Zabit Magomedsharipov. Welcome to Tier 4. Down here, there are a lot of very strange martial arts systems that are seldom discussed. Oil wrestling. Oh baby baby. Yeah, it's that point of the iceberg. We arrive at oil wrestling. Despite the fact that Dana never got oiled up because he is a big bold Baron Harkonnen liar.
I want to oil you up. What the f does that mean?
That doesn't mean that men of this sport won't. Practitioners of this sport have a few screws missing, because instead of signing up for boxing club or Greco-Roman wrestling, these men instead put their names in the hat to end up on the Grease squad. Oil wrestling is a traditional sport, courtesy of those from the lands of Turkey. It actually originates from over 4,000 years ago, where those of the Ottoman Empire would compete in giant mass oily competitions, tossing each other around, or whatever the terminology is. Competitions of this sport are won by grabbing effective control of your opponent's kispit. And no, that's not a euphemism, that's their leather trousers. This is done by putting one's arm through the kispit itself, as you may have seen recently, with Luke Rockhold and Craig Jones being super sus. According to the official rules of oil wrestling, however, the loser is the wrestler whose back touches the ground as a result of the opponent's actions. The winner can also be decided by the wrestler who raises his opponent and either carries him 3 steps or spins him around. If a wrestler's kispit is pulled down, revealing you know what, then he is automatically disqualified from the fight as well. As you can imagine, oil wrestling is quite the spectacle. I've heard John Jones loves it. Catch wrestling. Catch wrestling literally means catch anywhere you can. And as you can probably imagine by this rather vague saying, that whilst this sport predominantly resembles wrestling, that the rule set is rather loose and described as way more aggressive and brutal than traditional Cornish or Devonshire wrestling. Those are the ones that inspired the more modern forms of wrestling that we recognise today. Included in the rule set of catch wrestling are leg locks and submissions. Whilst pins are still the main way of winning catch wrestling matches, catch wrestling was also a term used to describe rough and tumble that was a popular pastime on the frontier in the 19th century, but that is something that we'll get into later. Catch wrestling ended up getting its popularity through carnivals throughout America, where locals would challenge carnies in a display of athleticism, and from there it would grow into an Olympic sport, ending up in the 1904 Olympics. I guess the main thing that surprised me when researching catch wrestling was that professional wrestling, as in WWE, was actually a legitimate combat sport, and was essentially made to determine who the best catch wrestler was. And so you can see where this is going. catch wrestling, in the professional sense, would end up becoming pre-arranged entertainment. Interest in the sport was dying out, and so catch wrestlers, in an attempt to make it more entertaining, would do predetermined moves, fights, and choreography. And so with it, catch wrestling as an actual sport began to die out in favor of this acting. Catch wrestling was taken to Japan by a few pioneers and would ultimately become an important foundation for the mixed martial arts that we know to come. As we know, Inoki versus Muhammad Ali was an important historical moment for mixed martial competition, and Inoki was a catch wrestler himself. The techniques for catch wrestling are extremely effective. The mixing of wrestling with different styles of submissions and the sheer brutality of catch wrestling in its early times led to the creations of lots of techniques that are still used today in MMA. People like Josh Barnett say that his background and study is in catch wrestling, and we all know how good that legend is. Luta Livre. Luta Livre owes a lot of its techniques to catch wrestling also, that and competitive judo. It combined both these sports with the ability to also do ground strikes. When watching it, you can kind of see how this and other sports arising in Brazil at the time in the mid-1900s was setting up the eventual rise of MMA, although no hard strikes are permitted in Luta Livre, such as closed fist strikes. Luta Livre, being from Brazil, had its rise alongside BJJ, and as you can imagine, practitioners of both sports didn't exactly care for each other. Because this martial art required no equipment like an expensive gi, it was considered a sport for the less fortunate, and thus was competed and practiced in the favelas. Many people consider the feud between BJJ and Luta Livre as a war between classes, a socio-economic divide played out in martial arts training. Valet Judo fights would take place between head representatives of each sport, which would ultimately lead to the downfall of Luta Livre, as practitioners of Luta Livre were seemingly unable to beat their rivals in fair matches, and essentially with the incredible popularity and commercial success of BJJ, Luta Livre died out, unfortunately a victim of the unstoppable machine that the Gracies had created. Jodo is the way of the Jo, and is a traditional Japanese martial art using a short staff called a Jo. The art is similar to Bojutsu and is strongly focused upon defense against the Japanese sword. The Jo is a short staff, usually around 3 to 5 feet long. It is reported that the way of the Jo can be traced back 400 years ago, after the greatest swordsman to ever live, the undefeated Musashi, defeated Konosuke, a user of the long staff, in utter shame at his defeat and the fact that Musashi spared his life. Took to wandering the mountains of Fukuoka, where after some deep meditation and soul-searching at what a fucking loser he was said to have experienced a great vision of a small child who told him to shorten the long staff. I mean, this story sounds completely embellished, but I continue. He then chopped off approximately 50 centimeters of the long staff, meaning that it could now be used in new and unique ways. This has come to now be known as Jodo. According to his own accounts, he would re-challenge Musashi and win this time, but this side of the story contradicts the agreed upon fact that Musashi was ultimately undefeated, just like our boy Khabib. To this day, Jodo, or Jojutsu, is still used by the modern police force in Japan. Dambe.
See it live and see these warriors do their thing, it's a pleasure for me.
Is that a knockout?
I was first introduced to Dambe through Kamaru Usman, the former UFC welterweight champion of the world, and a man who was born in Nigeria, the place that this ancient sport comes from. As you can see from the footage, two men will stand in a circle, each will have one hand wrapped with rope. This is the striking hand, also known as the spear. The other is the unwrapped hand, used for blocking, range finding, and distance control. This is known as the shield. Whilst you can kick in the sport, not every fighter actually chooses to do it, because it isn't oftentimes the most effective use of energy. Matches last 3 rounds of 3 minutes each. The winner is decided either by decision, knockdown, or knockout, or surrender. Dambe has its roots in warfare, hence why the name of the striking hand is the spear and the blocking hand is the shield, and why also a knockdown is called a kill. Taekyon is a traditional martial art from Korea that is designed to control the enemy with bare feet and hands, whilst defending oneself at the same time. It is characterized by flowing, athletic movements that is rather unique to watch be put on display. Though the origins of Taekyon are rather unfortunately lost to time, it is widely accepted that the art form would have been present during the Three Kingdoms period, as Taekyon movements were etched into Korean murals at the time. Later on, Taekyon became a liberal form of martial arts that was easily accessible to the public, and from there, it would go on to be enjoyed by many thousands of people. still kept alive today as an intrinsic part of Korean culture. It most resembles Taekwondo because, well, that's where Taekwondo developed from, it's believed, although both sports like to distance themselves from each other. From a Western frame of reference, though, it's pretty obvious that one inspired the other. Both Korean sports share a lot of similarities, that is. Taekon, however, is about flow, movement, breath, and being in tune with your inner self. It also has its very special footwork pattern, which is conducted barefoot, and it looks almost like a dance. Footwork is smooth and rhythmic, and enables rapid shifting of the center of gravity. This has the effect of strengthening a practitioner's waist and lower body part, as well as harmonizing attack and defense. Sparring of this martial art presents quite a unique proposition. Practitioners will sit around in a circle, divided into 2 groups or colors. One from each will then stand out and spar each other, going around until one person remains, who is then given the rather prestigious moment to peacock in front of the whole squad. You can see in this sparring footage that Taekon differentiates itself from Taekwondo in that the hands and feet are always flowing and moving, distracting the opponent until a strike or throw is landed. Silat. Silat is a collective term for a class of indigenous martial arts that originated in Southeast Asia, primarily in countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, and southern Philippines. It is a very versatile and highly adaptable form of combat that combines strikes, joint manipulation, throws, weaponry, and elements of traditional dance. Silat covers a vast array of not only martial arts, but dancing and rituals, so vast in fact that it would be kind of a bad idea to get really stuck in the thick of it in this style of iceberg, because we would be here for hours. So the main thing that Silat is known for is that of its effectiveness in street fights, which has been widely documented in YouTube videos, which then fail to actually tell you that Silat is about as useful as an ashtray on the back of a motorbike. It's once again one of those martial arts that has lost its traditional weaponry background and instead turned into a choreography dance for people to trick themselves into thinking it can be used in a street fight. Bujinkan. It's a school and curriculum that teaches the art of ninjutsu. Not much is to be said here that hasn't already been said in the ninjutsu entry on the last tier. Glima. Whilst I've been going through and researching this entire iceberg, I've been pleasantly surprised by the different types of martial arts that I have stumbled upon, and to be quite honest, one thing I absolutely was not expecting to find was Glima, a literal Viking martial art. I don't know what I was thinking, but I just always imagined Vikings being brutal savages, heaving axes into people's skulls for the glory, but it turns out these men are not only concentrated on the use of weapons, but also grappling, and so I present to you Glima. Sport Glima was most widespread throughout the Viking Age, and was practiced by both men and women of all ages, and combined a lot of Scandinavian folk wrestling styles and techniques, but the sport was also used in conjunction with the military men who would raid and plunder. So not only was it a great pastime for the Vikings, but it also had utility in warfare also. Glima follows suit with other wrestling styles, meaning that the objective is to get their opponent to the ground using throws, slams, sweeps, and clinches. But also taught as a part of Glima is limb manipulation and chokes, and for those who intend to go to war, Glima would have been done alongside weapons also. 52 block. 52 block is a rather controversial entry on this iceberg, as it's not really an art form, but rather a system of self-defense developed in the American prison system, which, if you want to be a martial artist, I don't think this really is the best base for it. Much like Kisai, there is an emphasis in this form to protect the head, and also jam the opponent's arm, as I assume they're often there to stab you with a shiv or something. 52 block is essentially boxing at its core though, and more of a street fighting form, so I'm sure that you can use your imaginations on this one. Ringen is a specific form of wrestling that was used throughout Europe, but more specifically Germany during the 15th and 16th century. It combined this art with a bit of swordsmanship, but essentially this is again just an ancient and specific form of wrestling that we have previously gone over. Single stick. Single stick is a sport that sits comfortably within a few martial arts that we have mentioned previously, namely Baritsu and fencing. It was developed to make those rather rambunctious sailors of the Royal Navy better at using their cutlass, so essentially a form of sparring. It would end up becoming its own form of competition, however, of which over its lifetime the rules changed and varied quite drastically, but followed along the same lines as fencing. Single sticks are roughly 30 to 36 inches in length and are traditionally made from ash wood. The basket hilt is made from wicker, reed or leather. This sport essentially died out despite attempts to revive it. I would assume due to the popularity of fencing. Single stick, however, will remain as an important part of British history, particularly for the Royal Navy, as it was important for making men of the seas far more deadly. And as we know, the Royal Navy was vital in getting the British Empire to its peak, Northern Shaolin. So everything that we discussed in the previous tier about Shaolin and Wushu still stands here with this entry. The main difference between Southern and Northern style Shaolin is that Northern is stylized by longer kicks, extended posture and strikes. See, Northern and Central China are lands of vast open plains. Therefore, the battles that took place in these regions would have played host to large battles, meaning that the Northern style of Kung Fu or Shaolin would have been developed to specifically deal with this in mind. Northern Shaolin also has a focus on weapons. Xingyi Quan. Xingyi Quan is an internal martial art form from China. As we discussed in the previous tier, this form is extremely aggressive, fast-paced and stiff movements that are intended to completely overwhelm the opponent, as you can see from the footage. It is very stylized and separates itself from others, but besides its differences, in its physical manifestation, the mental and philosophical elements stand out as well. This martial art form is that of inner alchemy, a martial art that, through its practice, can transform the inner body and align it back to a more natural state. This is done by using the 5 elemental fists, which regulate and harmonize internal organs, whilst developing different aspects of internal movement, martial skill, and internal strength. They are metal, wood, fire, earth, and water fist. The training of this martial art is fundamentally meditation. It is done to move without thinking and to interact with the world before the mind can comprehend its need to. That means, according to this martial art, with extensive training, one can become unnaturally explosive and powerful. Bujutsu is a broad term that's translation summarizes what it entails. Bu meaning war, and jutsu meaning technique. This art form covers all traditional martial arts from Japan, keeping the traditions of being a samurai and the Bushido code alive. Because it is a colloquial term for more specific stuff that we have already covered or yet to cover, it's probably best to move on to Kobudo. A Yabusame archer gallops down a sand track, his bow strewn tight, the bolt ready to be released to its mark. This martial art is keeping the tradition of Kobudo alive, a word that directly translates to old martial art. Whilst its roots are in warfare, Kobudo does not concern itself with the sporting element of martial arts. Instead, training in the old way, as it were, is a matter of life or death. Kobudo was practiced during the 17th to 19th century. It involves a practice of archery, swordsmanship, and jujutsu, and was tied heavily to the military of Japan at the time. As you can imagine, it is more practical and one with deadly intent of the Japanese martial arts systems that we have discussed previously. Koryu, another entry on this tier, is basically the same thing, and all that differentiates them is their specific priorities concerning combat, morals, discipline, and/or aesthetic form. Different regions from Japan would emphasize on particular elements. Lethwei. Lethwei has often been described as one of the most violent and badass sports by men who have come across it. Lethwei shares a lot of similarities with Muay Thai, yet differs in the fact that there are no gloves in this sport. The hands are wrapped, yet not with soft padding. Practitioners of this sport can headbutt, knee, punch, and elbow any body part really, yet they cannot partake in violence on the ground. Each bout can be booked as a 3, 4, or 5 round fight, with 3 minutes per round, and a rather unique 2-minute break between rounds. Championship fights must be 5 rounds though. David Ludek, a Canadian man who is considered a legend of this sport, and you might know him from his appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience, which is a great episode which I highly recommend checking out. Lethwei is also known as Burmese boxing, and it hails from the country of Myanmar, or Burma, depending on what your country actually calls that country. There exists some carvings on temples in central Myanmar plains which appear to show pairs of men locked in combat, suggesting that this sport is over 1,000 years old, and for that reason, Lethwei is regarded with particular cultural significance and cherished by its people. Lam, also known as Senegalese wrestling, is one of the most popular sports in the country of Senegal. This falls directly into the wrestling category, so keep in mind what we've already discussed previously with wrestling. With Lam though, the primary objective is to throw the opponent to the ground or force them out of the fighting area. This is achieved by picking them up overhead and slamming them down. Unlike many other forms of wrestling, striking and punching is actually allowed in certain styles of Lam. Wrestlers often engage in pre-fight rituals that include wearing of charms, amulets, and performing specific dances or prayers believed to bring luck and protection. These rituals are deeply rooted in Senegalese culture and spirituality, often involving traditional healers known as marabouts. The matches are accompanied by traditional drumming and singing, creating a festive atmosphere, much like we have seen with Lethwei and Muay Thai before us. Wrestlers will perform dances before the match, showcasing their strength and trying to intimidate their opponents. Much like the barbaric and ancient days of pancration, there is no emphasis on weight classes, and matches often entertain the crowd with mismatched opponents, creating some truly great underdog moments on the field. Senegalese wrestling has evolved into a professional sport, with major events broadcasted on television and attracting large sponsorships. They even have a purpose-built stadium to host this particular sport that can hold 20,000 people. Those who achieve great success in this sport are essentially celebrities in Senegal, and their efforts on the field is rewarded handsomely with significant prize money. Laijutsu. Laijutsu is a traditional Japanese martial art that focuses on techniques of quickly drawing and cutting a sword, typically the katana. The term Laijutsu translates roughly to the art of drawing the sword. It emphasizes fluid, efficient movements to respond to a sudden attack, usually from a seated or standing position. Welcome to Tier 5. Here things are dubious at the very best. Some of these martial arts systems are wacky and strange. Slap Kabaddi. Have you ever wondered what happens when Power Slap meets Bollywood? Well, I present to you the most zesty sport this world has to offer. Slap Kabaddi. Slap Kabaddi is the Pakistani variant of Kabaddi, a sport with its origins rooted in the popular region of Punjab. Two players aim to slap each other, scoring 1 point for each slap landed on the opponent, above the waist that is. The winner is the one who scores the most points, or who can force his opponent to forfeit the match. And I have to say, it is quite literally one of the most ridiculous things that I think I've ever seen. I mean, people complain about power slap for Christ's sake. Whilst punches are strictly forbidden in the rules, opponents can slam into each other if they choose, size having a massive advantage in this sport. There is no time limit or limit on the number of slaps that can be executed, though causing injury to the opponent results in disqualification in some matches. Combative Tai Chi. So we covered Tai Chi further back in the iceberg, and we focused a lot on the mental aspects that go along with Tai Chi. Well, it appears that there are those who think that Tai Chi can be translated into a combative sport. Tai Chi, as we know, is a form of defensive training, and even at that level, its effectiveness is extremely questionable, as seen by that guy that got knocked out in 10 seconds by an MMA dude. So anyway, there are out there some classes that do indeed teach combative Tai Chi. From what I can discern, combative Tai Chi is used in a very grappling heavy way. But like I say, combative Tai Chi isn't a real thing, so it's probably best to just move on to the next entry on this list. Gouging. We've all heard of the phrase rough and tumble before. What did you know that it actually came from a form of martial art? In the 18th and 19th century, men would partake in a bit of rough and tumble in the rural parts of America. Their main objective, you ask? Well, gouging each other's eyes out, of course. This, among with other disfiguring techniques, the art of rough and tumble, I'm sure you can imagine, was mainly used to settle disputes amongst people in the most horrific way possible. This is an extension of catch wrestling, which we discussed earlier as well. Men would schedule their face-offs against each other, almost as if a sporting event, and so whilst this was never considered an actual sport within itself, or recognised as a martial art, participants of this often life-changing and lethal activity were regarded in their local community as heroes. The act of gouging, or rough and tumble, waned with the invention of the revolver and Browning pistol. I'm sure you can imagine that it was just much easier to shoot someone that was pissing you off rather than trying to actually claw or gouge their eyes out. A professor of urban American history would write on the matter concerning gouging. Around the beginning of the 19th century, men sought original labels for their brutal style of fighting: rough and tumble, or simply gouging. It gradually replaced boxing as the name for these contests. The emphasis on maximum disfigurement, on severing bodily parts, made the fighting style unique. Amid their general mayhem, however, gouging out an opponent's eye became the sine qua non of rough and tumble fighting. Much like the knockout punch in modern boxing, the best gougers, of course, were adept at other fighting skills. Some allegedly filed their teeth to bite off an enemy's appendages more effectively. Still, liberating an eyeball quickly became a fighter's surest route to victory and his most prestigious accomplishment. Never thought I'd read that sentence. Men would often aim for lips, ears, eyes, and genitals. An act passed by the Virginia Assembly in 1752 begins by remarking that many mischievous and ill-disposed persons have of late, in a malicious and barbarous manner, maimed, wounded, defaced many of His Majesty's subjects. Then very specifically makes it a felony to pull out an eye, slit the nose, bite or cut off a nose or lip, among other offences. With it, gouging soon began to wane into distant memory. Batterect, I don't know if I'm saying that right, it's an Irish word, is Irish stick fighting. It's one of the many rich and diverse martial arts traditions from Ireland. Interestingly, it's not just a single fighting style, but rather a broad category encompassing various combat arts, in which practitioners wield wooden sticks or branches, often fashioned into canes for self-defense and protecting their communities. Even if the term Bateract is unfamiliar, you might recognize one of its most iconic weapons, the Sealali. Obviously, I don't even know if I'm saying that right, to be honest with you. Today, it's more recognizable as a walking stick with a knobbled end, typically made from blackthorn wood. It's often thought of as a tool for elderly people, hikers, or as a charming souvenir for tourists. However, its appearance as a simple walking stick is part of its disguise. Traditionally, it is a weapon, a concealed tool for combat. This martial art is deeply rooted in the culture of Irish people. It evolved as a martial art of resistance against invasions, whilst much of what we know about this martial art that comes from Ireland is from the era of the faction fights in Ireland. The art's origins stretch much further back into Irish history. These faction fights are often oversimplified, but as historians like John Hurley have shown, this martial art was already a significant part of Irish life, not only in battle, but also in dance, rituals, and plays. Bokator. Bokator translates to pound a tiger or smash a tiger. It is considered to be one of the oldest martial arts from South Asia, tracing all the way back to century 1 AD. In a lot of ways, it resembles that of Muay Thai or even the striking elements of MMA, as every single body part is allowed to be used as a weapon and taught to be used as such. It was utilized by the ancient Cambodian armies as a combat system, using not only limbs, but weapons and shields. Some of the weapons used in the martial art include bamboo staffs, short sticks, and a sword. An inscription from the 7th century, discovered at the site of Wat Phu, says, "He, the first who knew the science of combating the impetuosity of elephants, the force of cavalry, the will of man." There are many inscriptions and relics that have been found that describe the ancient combat art of Bokator, and its deep, rich, and expansive lore is a true beauty of the world. The relief etched into ancient stone paints a picture of a fierce and dedicated set of warriors that would protect the men and women of Cambodia. Men highly trained in the art of warfare, they must have been a truly intimidating force to stand across from in the battlefield. Today, the martial art of Bokator is still practiced by many devout students. It now has a ranking system, and it's great to see this culture still live and breathe their ancient roots. You can even see here techniques of this martial art colorized in a wall from the 12th century, and it goes to show just how ingrained this martial art was in Cambodia. Ladrit. Ladrit was developed by the namesake Royal Thai Navy officer Visit Ladrit in 1967, who combined various grappling and striking martial arts such as Aikido, Karate, and traditional Muay Thai, of which he was said to be a master of the style of Muay Karat. Ladrit intended to create the most optimal close-quarter combat martial art to teach his Thai soldiers, and well, apparently, he did just that. Ladrit demonstrated the techniques to the ruler of Thailand at the time. The king was thoroughly impressed by Ladrit's techniques and styles, though was quick to remark that the martial art created was so unfathomably dangerous that it should never be taught to a civilian. As such, Ladrit was only taught to Thai soldiers to allow them to defend themselves in close combat scenarios. As you can imagine, a mixed match of all the sports named above creates quite the spectacle. Due to the military nature of this combat system, there is little known about it other than what we can see in the videos of soldiers practicing this art, which I've shown on screen. Jogo de Pau. Jogo de Pau, often translated as stick game, is a unique and traditional Portuguese martial art with very unique characteristics. Originating in the northern regions of Portugal, this combat style evolved from a practical need for self-defense, with shepherds and rural villagers adopting the stick as an on-hand weapon and making it a practical means of defense. Much like the Irish art that we discussed previously, it was passed down through generations. This stick became an essential tool for not only kicking ass in disputes, but also using it against thieves. But on top of that, and perhaps most importantly, actually protecting villages. I mean, imagine rocking up in a quaint Portuguese village and a band of unruly shepherds with their sticks starts spinning heads. It's quite the theatrical defense for a community. Its techniques taught informally from one person to the next. Throughout history, Jogo de Pau was commonly used in various contexts, from personal duels to more friendly and honourable dust-ups at fairs, often pitting one or two fighters against larger groups. There are historical accounts of groups of players using Jogo de Pau techniques against Napoleonic troops during the invasions. As internal migrations brought people southward, Jogo de Pau also spread to areas surrounding Lisbon, where northern masters, armed with exclusive teaching rights, established schools to preserve and promote the art. However, by the mid-20th century, Jogo de Pau began to decline. Despite its once enormous popularity, it has since faded into obscurity. Currently, only a few schools, primarily in Lisbon, continue to represent this fading tradition of self-defense. Defendo. Defendo is a close combat self-defense system and was created with real-world combat scenarios in mind, emphasizing simple, brutal, and effective techniques suitable for military, law enforcement, and civilians alike. Unlike traditional martial arts, Defendo was not bound by ritual or sports rules. It was a no-nonsense approach to self-defense, crafted particularly for life or death situations. Defendo was the creation of all-round badass William E. Fairbairn, a man who was a green-lit British Royal Marine and who would later work with the Shanghai police, where he would develop his hand-to-hand combat system. Shanghai was a place where he faced violent street confrontations and dealt with dangerous criminal gangs. This experience heavily influenced his approach to combat as he sought to create a system that would allow law enforcement and military personnel to neutralize threats as quickly and effectively as possible. Fairbairn's Defendo was heavily influenced by various martial arts that he studied, including the original Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, along with this, Chinese martial arts and Western boxing. Alongside his partner, Eric A. Sykes, Fairbairn put all their various techniques in a mixing pot and spat out the other side of it. Defendo, a martial art focusing on moves that could be learned quickly and applied under extreme stress. The goal was to strip away unnecessary complexity, leaving only the most effective methods in incapacitating an opponent. Defendo's techniques are designed for rapid deployment and maximum effect, making it a pioneer in modern close-quarters combat. Defendo emphasizes targeting vulnerable parts of the body, such as the eyes, throat, groin, and knees. Techniques include palm strikes, karate chops, knee strikes, and powerful kicks, aimed at disabling an attacker with minimal effort. The system also includes various throws, sweeps, and joint locks, adapted from Jiu-Jitsu, designed to quickly take down an opponent in a controlled manner. Recognizing the prevalence of weapons in combat, Defendo includes methods for disarming armed attackers as well, particularly those wielding knives, batons, or firearms. Fairbairn's Defendo stressed the importance of mental preparedness and aggression in combat. Practitioners were taught to attack with speed, surprise, and decisiveness, ensuring that they could take control of confrontation before the opponent had time to react. It gained its prominence during World War II, where Fairbairn, along with Sykes, was recruited to train Allied soldiers, spies, and commandos in close-quarters combat. Their system became a foundational element of military hand-to-hand combat training, particularly for the elite units such as the British Commandos, the Office of Strategic Services, and other special operation forces. Fairbairn's methods were published in manuals like Get Tough and All in Fighting, which outlined practical self-defense techniques for soldiers facing close-quarter encounters. These manuals were widely distributed and became influential in shaping modern combat training doctrines. Although the term Defendo fell out of common usage after World War II, Fairbairn's principles continued to influence modern self-defense and military combatants. Many of Defendo's core techniques are still taught in various forms today, and we were talking about one earlier, Krav Maga, so you can just see how influential Defendo was. Gatka is a traditional martial art closely associated with the Sikhs of Punjab. Known for its dynamic and fluid stick fighting techniques, Gatka involves the use of wooden sticks that simulate swords, combining combat skill with cultural performance. The term Gatka arrives from the Punjabi name for wooden stick used in practice, which many have evolved from the Sanskrit word Gada, meaning mace. The primary weapon in Gatka is a wooden stick, typically measuring between 90 and 100 centimeters in length. The sticks also have fitted leather hilts and are frequently adorned with colourful Punjabi-style threads. In addition to the stick, practitioners of Gatka also use a shield called Fari. It is crafted from dry leather and filled with either cotton or dry grass. The shield is designed to protect the hand during full contact strikes, making it essentially part of the combat technique in Gatka. The origins of Gatka can be traced back to the 15th century in Punjab, coinciding with the rise of Sikhism under the leadership of Guru Nanak, and subsequently Sikh gurus who emphasized the importance of self-defense and martial prowess. It was historically practiced by Sikh warriors, particularly during the times of conflict, as a way to train and prepare for battle, embodying the Sikh principle of saint soldier, which merges spirituality with martial responsibility. In the 20th century, Gatka experienced a significant revival. As a cultural sport and performance art, the International Gatka Federation was established in 1982 and formalized in 1987, helping to codify the art and promote it on a global stage. Today, Gatka is not only practiced as a form of self-defense, but also celebrated as a sport and sword dance performance. Okchitore. The Cree Indians made up the largest Native American people in Canada, living north and west of Lake Superior. The martial art of Okchitore, as written by Redditor poster Mac Tyson, was created by a member of their community who had trained in traditional native combat techniques when he was younger, and then later trained in judo, taekwondo, and hapkido. His taekwondo master encouraged him to embrace his traditions of native combat and to find ways to preserve, research, and propagate this knowledge. This direction and guidance was also pressed into him by traditional elders throughout the indigenous community of Canada. The creator combined his knowledge of Native American combat systems with his indigenous culture values and extensive martial arts experience to codify the Canadian Plains Cree combat system, which in turn spewed out the other side of it, the martial art known as Okchitore. The creator of this martial art is the man himself, George J. Lapine, and was pioneered in the 1990s. According to Okchitore martial art website, the martial arts uses weapons such as Plains Cree Gunstock War Club, tomahawks, lances, and knives. Shotokan. Shotokan is an offshoot of Aikido. This form has a greater emphasis on sparring, or randori as it's called, and Shotokan has a bit more of a judo influence. Some claim that this fully resistant sparring allows for the martial art to be more effective in real life scenarios. It's probably just the Aikido guys trying to convince themselves that they could beat up Mike Perry or something, so that's about it. It's basically Aikido with more sparring. Kisai. The Kisai fighting method, or KFM, is a form of martial arts based on self-defense and the use of natural instinct. Its techniques focus predominantly on guard moves, including the use of elbows in close combat, and defense moves that protect vital organs, such as the head. Its application can be used against more than one opponent, and it was popularized by movies such as The Dark Knight and the Bourne Ultimatum franchise. The overarching consensus of this martial art, that's in inverted commas by the way, is that it is mainly theatrical in nature. Whilst the founders tried to base their system in some kind of logical extrapolation of what the human is most likely to do when attacked, they forgot that instead of buying into this covering up and protection instinct, what they should have done is what all other martial arts do, which is to train people not to react like that, cowering up, etc. So that's where this martial art belongs, in the movie theatres. You don't see people fighting like this in the octagon, and that's because it doesn't work. Suntukan. This is essentially boxing, but from the Philippines. Essentially, Suntukan means fist fight or brawl in the native language, so you can just imagine that it's boxing but with less rules. A lot of Filipino boxing champions actually claim that they have a background in Suntukan. Combat Gopak, also known as Boyovi Hopak, is a traditional Ukrainian martial art that combines elements of combat, acrobatics, and dance, inspired by the cultural heritage of the Cossacks, the famed warriors of Ukraine. Combat Gopak blends the agility and expressive movements of traditional Ukrainian folk dance with practical fighting techniques, creating a unique martial system that reflects the spirit and history of the Ukrainian people. Taya Mache. Taya Mache, meaning pull the machete, is a traditional Haitian martial art that centers around machete fighting. This unique form of combat combines elements of traditional African martial systems with influences from European fencing, creating a rather dynamic and deadly art that has deep historical roots in Haitian culture. Unlike other martial arts that are often practiced openly, Taya Mache is shrouded in secrecy, practiced within tight-knit communities, and often passed down through generations with families. The origins of tire mache trace back to the Haitian Revolution, a pivotal struggle in which enslaved Africans rose up against their French colonial rule. This was in the late 19th century. Many of these revolutionary fighters were armed with machetes, the ubiquitous tool for plantation laborers used for cutting sugarcane. They used them against a far more powerful and far better equipped French colonial army, but these freedom fighters stood up against them, armed with nothing but a machete, demonstrating unparalleled skill and courage. During the revolution, African combat traditions brought by enslaved people merged with European fencing techniques, giving birth to a unique form of machete fighting that prioritized speed, precision, and strategic movement. Tire mache became a symbol of resistance, a martial art born from the need to survive and liberate. Despite its deep roots in Haitian history, tire mache remained largely unknown outside of Haiti. One of the most significant figures in the art's modern revival was Haitian master fencer Alfred Avril, who dedicated much of his life to preserving the teachings of tire mache. Avril, who passed away unfortunately in 2014, was renowned for his mastery of the machete and was one of the first people to expose the world to tire mache, breaking the tradition of secrecy surrounding the art. Welcome to Tier 6. A short one, but what it doesn't have in length, it makes up for in absurdity. Radabor. It's hard to actually find any legitimate information on this, so instead, this is a description found from a YouTube video on screen now. The YouTuber is taken from Mikita Do, a martial arts YouTuber who covers all styles of that world, much like this video in fact, but just in greater detail and full videos on specific styles. I can only assume that the person who actually created this iceberg was heavily influenced by the work of this YouTuber, so I highly recommend checking out his videos if you get the chance, linked in the description. So let me just read out the basic summation of Radabor, while some clips of Radabor are shown on screen. Radabor is the most obscure modern Russian martial arts. Contrary to the most modern schools, Radabor is not particularly interested in spreading its influence abroad, not even around Russia itself, since it only has a handful of schools. Radabor was born around 15 years ago with the collaboration of Yevgeny Pashin and Alexander Soliev, Pashin himself being an expert in ARB, a Soviet hand-to-hand combat system, and he was very particular about the real functionality of this martial art. It is also obvious that he has implemented elements from Soviet Sistema, since the exercises in Radabor are all based on the softness training, coordination, and breathing. It also claims to have common roots with the traditional Russian fist fighting. Russian martial arts are notorious for clinging to the ancient roots. Such claims are often historically questionable though. Another noteworthy element is the apparent similarity to the international Chinese martial art and other international martial arts such as Aikido. However, in the case of Radabor, it seems like they have managed to make it work by combining soft techniques with realistic, vicious pace. Corrida, an Aboriginal elder of Australia, tormented by all the young men dying at the hands of Nula Nula, a traditional form of combat that used clubs and spears, conducted between groups, often as a pastime, but quickly and often descended into duels. The elder sat there, wondering what it is that he could do to stop this often senseless violence. But then suddenly, the misty morning spat out a vision on the lakefront, that of a snake, and it spoke to him in tongues. It spoke the words, "Look at the kangaroos." And just as it materialized from nothing, so did it disappear. The elder had realized that this was no snake, it was indeed the rainbow serpent, a protector of the lands, and the source for all life for the Aboriginals. The elder heeded the words of this most powerful sign, and he took to watching the kangaroos fight. He noticed in his studies that kangaroos did not senselessly fight. Unlike Nula Nula, they had rules for their scraps. Inspired by the creature's respect and honor in battle, he went back to instill this philosophy in his own tribe, and such was born the traditional combat game of Corrida, meaning kangaroo spirit in the language of the Ngiampa, who settled in the Kobar region, a game of sparring based on the big red kangaroo. It was a game that unfortunately had been snuffed out of memory in the 1870s when the lands were so tragically invaded by foreigners. But in recent times, it has made a comeback thanks to community leaders in New South Wales. They are bringing back the lost art of Corrida and teaching it and its very unique rules once again. Corrida starts with a dance. The dance component, which is mostly based on traditional kangaroo dance steps. It is the initial warm-up ritual and gives competitors an opportunity to display their abilities in strength, speed, and agility. The combat element is divided into 3 segments. The idea is that the competitors can only touch the ground with their hands and feet and must stay within the boundary for a 1 minute of motion, likened in appearance to the Brazilian combat dance of capoeira. The next segment is more like a sumo match, in which competitors try to push each other outside of the circle or make the other touch the ground with any part of their body other than their hands and feet. The dance is important for determining which position the competitors will take in the combat component. Corrida combat is divided into 4 rounds, or quarters, each lasting a maximum of 2 minutes. The winner of the dance component can choose which position they will start in inside the circle, known as the defender, or outside the circle, known as the attacker. The role of the attacker is to try and force the defender outside of the boundary by means of pushing, throwing, or rolling them, all within the time limit of 20 seconds. The role of the defender is to restrain the attacker within the sun for longer than 20-second time count. Competitors swap positions each quarter, and the point score is maintained until the end of the match. The story behind corrida is fascinating, and this style is certainly very, very unique with its different elements, and it's great to see it being brought back to life by its community leaders for all to learn about once again. Buza. Hailing from the ancient lands of Novgorod, Buza is a traditional hand-to-hand Russian folkloric fighting style. It often utilizes weapons as a part of its style. Similar to capoeira, the folkloric fighting style can be described as a dance of sorts, taking many movement elements from that of Tropak and Hopak dances, which utilizes spinning kicks, sweep kicks. Buza will also be conducted using traditional Russian costumes. There is also traditional musical accompaniment, and medieval weapons are used, such as sticks and knives. Most of the Buza practitioners are Orthodox Christians. The philosophy of Buza is based on the Russian traditions and customs. The ancient martial art developed over centuries in a region where, in the early 2nd millennium, the Novgorodian Rus was formed. Nowadays, Buza is taught in special police units, such as drug police or jail guards. Unlike most Russian styles, Buza participates in sparring and competition fights with other schools. Buza groups are functioning in more than 20 cities in Russia. There is not a lot of information out there on Buza, to be perfectly honest. I think I found less than 1,000 words actually written on it in my hour or 2 of research, but there are plenty of videos of people using it, which you have the pleasure of watching over this writing. As stated previously, Buza has a lot of similarities with capoeira, which the next entry on this list also has. Jugo de Mani. The word mani is said to mean war in an indeterminate African language, and is not a reference to peanuts, which the word mani can also refer to in Cuban Spanish. Its longer Spanish name, Jugo de Mani, would thus mean war game or war dance. Originating from Cuba, Jugo de Mani was brought to the small island by African slaves in the 16th century. In a bid to disguise their learning of a martial art form from their owners, the slaves would hide their strikes and kicks in the form of a dance, giving it that signature capoeira style. Some of their masters would recognize it as fighting competition and gamble on their outcomes, and tragically, it has been documented that a lot of slave owners who recognized the sport would inevitably make the practitioners fight to the death. It is separated from capoeira in the sense that oftentimes in this martial art, weapons will be used as part of the dance. This can be anything from a machete to a knife to a stick. A practitioner of this martial art utilizes such techniques as foot sweeps, punches, headbutts, and elbow strikes. In addition, forearm strikes, knee strikes, and palm strikes may also be used by the fighter. Due to the musical nature that disguised this martial art from slave owners, there is a rhythmical element to how all strikes and blows are landed or attempted. The music for the bout of Jugo de Mani is usually produced by drums. This sport seems to be fading with time, never becoming globally recognized. Combative yoga. I think this might actually be a joke, but there is a video for all those yoga people out there that also happen to be into martial arts. Maybe those who train in combat need to just, relax a little. Lima Lama. It wouldn't be Polynesian martial arts if it didn't take elements from street fighting. The founder of this sport was a member of the Samoan royal family. From a young age, he studied in Hapkido, Shaolin Kung Fu, Judo, boxing, and Hung Gar. A lot of his foundation, however, comes from traditional Polynesian combat learnt from his father and uncle. He would use this base of training to go on to be an amateur boxer, fighting in more than 100 matches. He served in the US military during the 1950s, participating in the Battle of Inchon and serving as a hand-to-hand combat instructor. He would later set out to create his own school of combat, combining everything he was ever taught from all elements of martial arts, but putting a focus on his traditional Polynesian background. Thus, the world of Lima Lama was born. Lima Lama is a system of self-defense which consists of circular motions and movements with a specific curriculum of techniques and forms. It is characterized by flowing, dance-like movements. Around 60% of its curriculum is based on hand techniques. It also uses holds and takedowns, knife and stick fighting and kicking. Lima Lama classifies its techniques into 13 categories, some of which are dance traditions, wrestling, circular movement, holds and takedowns, traps and locks. Lima Lama translates to the hand of wisdom in English, using the Samoan words for hand and knowledge. For me, when I watch this martial art play out, I can't help but notice that it veers a bit towards Bushido in a sense, perhaps why we haven't seen anyone in the UFC claim they come from this background. But because a lot of the foundation of Lima Lama comes from a traditional martial art, the water is certainly murky. It seems to me this rich royal family member wanted to just do his own thing, and you can't fault a man for wanting to bring attention to his culture and their particular way of combat. Abrazer. The Friulians were a people of farming, nobility, and of great significance in the northwestern region of Italy. With their own dialect, they certainly stood apart, nestled in their lands of great beauty. One of the nobles who hailed from this land was that of the most famous Fior, a man who has great significance in the world of martial arts. The man was one of the greatest knights to have ever lived, but beyond that, one of the greatest teachers of the art of combat to have ever graced the world. His manual, The Flowers of War, is considered one of the oldest surviving fencing manuals to ever exist. See, Fior's expertise was that of an Italian master of fencing and swordsmanship, and whilst we have already covered many aspects of swordplay and fencing, I don't really want to go over all of it, but one aspect that separates this master's teaching from others is that of Abrazer, which was the grappling element of Fior's teaching. Abrazer is a base upon which Fior builds his system. The critical techniques, or plays as they are called in the manuscript, are the fundamental principles of the art. Abrazer requires 8 things: strength, speed, knowledge of grips, knowledge of how to break limbs, knowledge of how to apply locks, knowledge of where to strike, knowledge of how to throw your opponent to the ground, knowledge of how to dislocate limbs. What differed Fior's work from other fencing masters at the time was his concentration on the physical manipulation of his opponents, and whilst the grappling section that remains only contains 16 plays, they serve as a fundamental foundation to all the other plays in the rest of the Flowers of Battle. Grappling the opponent was seen as a massive advantage, especially because other knights of this era were more than likely concentrating on other elements of combat and fencing. He also concentrated heavily on manipulating the opponent's sword, so the philosophy of taking your opponent off balance plays out in all techniques of the Flowers of Battle. Ultimately, Abrazer is the mastery of grappling, and according to Fior, 4 of the 5 steps that lead you to finishing your opponents is based on grappling, as seen in some of the photos and footage shown here. The idea of the fulcrum underpins all of the grappling techniques in this work. There is a few images on screen now of essentially how the fulcrum works, but at a base understanding, Fior saw the intricate dance of swordsmanship as a physics problem rather than an actual duel, and so the manipulation of a load around a fulcrum was how he wanted his students to apply his teachings. The load is often your actual opponent, the manipulation of which was the force that you applied to him or her. Most stances that Fior instructed would mean that the practitioner would have a stable fulcrum, making sure that your center of gravity was the middle of your own body, and around that, you would lever your opponent to the ground and then dispose of him once there. You can see how a lot of his techniques looked in the remaining pages of the Flower of War here. The surviving pages of his manuscript are a thing of beauty to behold. Fior was a pioneer in the oh so ancient and distant world of those who would gallivant across the continent, fighting with pointy swords. The ancient pages of his lifetime of work are a true wonder to the world, especially as it pertains to martial arts. There is so much more that could be said about the Flowers of War, and so if you're interested in all this, then please check it out. But this part of the iceberg was simply dedicated to the base knowledge of the grappling element. Welcome to tiers 7 and 8, which I've squeezed together. Frankly, good luck to you. Some of this stuff is the stupidest shit I've ever heard. Shin kicking. Whilst you may initially think that Tony Ferguson leads the vanguard with his entry into the iceberg because that man notoriously has shins made of granite, many of his opponents even discussing the fact that he would actively kick shin on shin, despite significantly hurting both of them.
I remember when we fought, I'm Southpaw, he's Orthodox, right? He throws that inside kick, and I'm turning my leg over to check it, and like, it was never at my knee. He was throwing that at my shin.
Shin kicking is actually a sport that comes from 17th century England, and the premise of this sport is that each participant will grab a hold of each other on the collar. Traditionally, this would have been their shepherd's smock, and then attempt to smash each other in the shins with their foot, each competitor going until the other is forced to the ground due to the pain. Or in a more gentlemanly display of sportsmanship, shout, "Sufficient." The sport found its place in the Cotswold Olympic Games, an annual celebration in England that follows suit to the actual Olympic Games, but is only conducted in the West Country of England and features more English-type sports and games such as horse riding and tea drinking, and of course, shin kicking. At the historic Cotswold Games, participants now wear lab coats. I know shin kicking well, as it's actually a deep part of my heritage, being a proud Cornish man, a county that more than once has tried to declare its independence from the country of England, and quite famously, Cornish people have been given their ethnic minority status as of 2014. I come from a long line of Cornish miners, and it was their particular pastime of shin kicking that was used to settle disputes, something that eventually would become a betting pastime as well. They would also settle disputes with Cornish wrestling, something that we have previously discussed in the first tier of this iceberg. They would also use clogs during their shin kicking episodes, and I can't imagine anything more painful than being clobbered by a clog in the shin. Modern games of shin kicking still are participated in England, and they are either resolved with the former sufficient or dropped to the ground in pain, but now they have a scoring system out of 10. The winner of 6 kicks walks away the victor. Much like Tony Ferguson during training, many would train their shins by hitting them with hammers or choosing to get kicked with steel toe caps. People like Wonderboy have shown techniques still used today to harden shins, and you can imagine that this would be very useful for the sport of shin kicking. Pommel throwing. Pommel throwing comes from 2 pictures that have come from ancient manuscripts dating back to the early 15th century. The first image is more widely known from the German fencing manual, Gladiatoria. In the picture you can see that, on the left, one of the knights is throwing something at his opponent. That is in fact the pommel of his sword, of which in ancient times would twist off of the sword after 3 or 4 turns, and then be used as a distraction to the face before hitting your opponent with a blow. Until recently this technique was fairly unrecognized, and when the YouTuber Scalagrim did a YouTube video on it a few years ago, many people considered this way of sword fighting a joke, or that the manuscript was simply just making stuff up, many critics saying that it was just not efficient. The video was entitled "Ending Him Rightly," which the YouTuber had translated from the manuscript, but it turns out the correct translation is "Ending Him Quickly." Here is a video from the same YouTuber on how this technique would have been used in ancient times. In the second video a few years later, the YouTuber would describe how there is a second photo shown here from an entirely different manuscript showing the exact same thing, calling into question the critics. It seems that this technique very much would have been used during duels or fencing tournaments. Also, further translation of the original manuscript actually details defenses from pommel throwing, meaning that the author may not have been joking after all. It is very unsportsmanlike, but considering that you are about to stab each other with long pointy metal things, I would say that all is fair in love and war. So ending him quickly, or pommel throwing, is a way of throwing your opponent off guard and then finishing him off before he has a chance to react. The question then becomes, why use pommel throwing when you could use any other object? But that can be answered by the fact that these manuscripts were just for judicial duels that were used to settle disputes under the eyes of God. Therefore, the arena where these duels would be conducted would have been cleared of debris and rocks. A clean battleground for the opponents meant that the pommel may very well be the only thing that they are able to chuck in their circumstances. If you want to learn more about this and the manuscripts, then I highly recommend checking out his channel on screen now. It's WWE, but it's real. I'm not going to sit here and shit on the WWE, as some might expect. Whilst I'm not a watcher of the sport of the professional wrestling, I 100% see the entertainment value in it. Some of the clips from the WWE in recent years, it's been truly hilarious to watch, and I can see why so many people are invested in it. Now imagine, if you will, for a second, if all that athleticism and that prowess that those athletes display in the ring was actually real for a second. I know it may be truly impossible to comprehend with your tiny, unconscious mind, but if the RKO, the DDT, and the Cold Stone Stunner were all applicable on the streets, well then these men of the WWE would be truly terrifying. Turning the other cheek, the Mount of Beatitudes has long been considered as the physical site at which the Sermon on the Mount took place, whilst other places such as the Mount of Arbel and the Horns of Haytin also have merits as being the precipice where the sermon took place. It is the Mount of Beatitudes that this entry on the list belongs to. I will now read a chapter from the New Testament, chapter 5 on the Gospel of Matthew. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do you resist the one who is evil? But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go a mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Turning the other cheek is an extremely well-known saying, particularly in Western culture, and whilst the direct writings out of Matthew's Gospel seems to really say everything that we need to know, there have been various interpretations of what is actually being said by Jesus of Nazareth, from Christian anarchism, which says that it preaches for total non-resistance to such a degree that the act of doing so brings further aggression to the situation. Another interpretation is that of non-violent resistance, which was explained on Louder with Crowder, and so I assume that the entry on this list tries to impart some philosophical and religious teachings on us, saying why train martial arts, when in all cases we should turn the other cheek and avoid violence in order to shame our attackers from a social stance. Other interpretations of turning the cheek actually point towards this segment of the Sermon on the Mount being that about mindfulness rather than how you act in physical flesh. Eckhart Tolle writes in his book The Power of Now, "This is the miracle of surrender. You may have heard the phrase turn the other cheek, which a great teacher of enlightenment used 2,000 years ago. He was attempting to convey, symbolically, the secret of non-resistance and non-reaction. In this statement, as in all others, he was concerned only with your inner reality, not with the outer conduct of your life. And so, turning the other cheek, you really need to think how, if you are trained in martial arts, how you apply your violence, your controlled violence." Mexican martial arts, March 7th of 2016. Just 2 days after Nate Diaz plummeted us into an alternative timeline by choking out Conor McGregor in the second round of UFC 196, a YouTube channel named Mexican Martial Arts would upload his first ever video breaking down the fight. His name was Jesse, and he was the Grand Master of Mexican Martial Arts. What would follow can only be described as groundbreaking. Jesse would detail in a series of videos that expanded on the deep and rich lore of Mexican martial arts, the clips of which are equally hilarious as they are entertaining.
This fool's not a good striker or defender, which is why he grapples. So he takes me to the ground immediately. That fool not that hard.
For me, it's beautiful to see Jesse on this list, because he was one of the first people that I would ever watch as a gateway into MMA. It must have been the first couple of videos that he uploaded that me, as a virgin fan of the sport, managed to stumble upon. He guided me into martial arts and made me excited for the events upcoming, and whilst his Mexican martial arts videos often faded into the background in favour of his more viral breakdowns and commentary videos, they were always so funny when he would make a new one. I can honestly say, if it wasn't for Jesse and Mexican martial arts, I probably wouldn't be making videos on YouTube myself, and whilst his career has since descended into a love-hate relationship with the platform, which is understandable, I always check out his sporadic uploads to see how he is doing. I understand how and why YouTubers fall off in this space. Lucas Tracy most recently a victim, Keon Kimura last year. Various reasons, either algorithmically, burnout, money, whatever it is. Despite what many people think about what it means working on this platform, I know that I'm comfortable with the fact that my views will decline from here on out. I'm at peace with this fact. This is all transient. In a lot of ways, most of the things that I wanted to say about this sport I love so much have already been said. I enjoy creating things and writing, and I've made literally some of my best friends through this process. But from what I've gathered, and what Jesse stands the testament to, is the fact that YouTube will spit me and other creators out the other side, a 5-year life cycle that is set in stone. God bless Mexican martial arts, and thank you for every video, my friend. Bullshido. Bullshido has an official explanation as this: martial arts fraud, especially exaggerated or fraudulent claims regarding the biography, lineage, skills, or experience of martial arts instructors. I doubt you could have explored the dark depths of the internet without ever encountering some kind of video or some master of Bullshido. In fact, a lot of this stuff regarding Bullshido is simply ingrained in the world of martial arts, from memes, joke videos, to full-blown documentaries on the world of Bushido, Steven Seagal, Count Dante, Charlie Zelenoff. The list is quite frankly exhaustive. I would like to look to my good friend Napoleon Bonaparte as a great place to begin your research on Bushido. He has already 3 utterly fantastic videos on the subject, all over or around an hour long, that explores in depth all matters of Bushido. His videos cover everything from different styles to the grandmasters of Bushido themselves and their incredible and really weird stories. I guess the main thing that he's covering in these videos as well is how these Bushido masters trick thousands of people into believing their insane and non-existent skills. It would honestly take me hours, as it has taken Napoleon Bonaparte to cover this. So, I mean, Bushido kind of explains itself, and it's not really a martial art. We are actually going to cover some of the grandmasters of Bushido down below in a second. As an introduction, Bushido is just made-up martial arts, essentially. Russian snake style. So this is one of the offshoots of Bushido, and it has made its way onto this list due to the sheer effectiveness of its techniques and the true majesty of its head practitioner. This master calls his Russian disabled eagle praying mantis martial arts Charyuk, which, if you are to take this drunk Russian master at his word, has its roots from the lands of Korea, a martial art that has unfortunately been lost to the annals of history. Charyuk, if taken to its direct ancient translation, comes to say, the perfect human being. And if you are watching what I'm watching on screen right now, then you can only assume that what this Russian master is saying must be true. The nature of Charyuk is deeply entwined with spirituality as well, and whilst a lot of martial arts do focus on the inner journey, Charyuk has a massive emphasis on it, so much so that practitioners that want to learn all aspects of becoming the perfect human must live the life of a hermit, nothing but the wilderness, the self, and the art of Charyuk. It is here where those wanting to understand the true inner workings of the Russian snake style are to also consume mushrooms, sleep on the grass during summers, and upon the snow during winters. Charyuk is not for the faint of heart, but for those who want to understand the way of the perfect human and to move like the legend. Then these are the steps that you must follow to become a true Russian snake master. Jubox Fu. I want to take you back to October 30th, 1999, to the inaugural King of the Cage event, a show quite fittingly named The Beginning. Probably a callback to the first ever UFC event which had the same name. That fact remains even more likely true when you consider that the King of the Cage was an MMA promotion that was created by MMA pioneer and all-around badass Bas Rutten, the former heavyweight UFC champion of the world. In the 13th fight of that night, 2 debut professional fighters would take to the cage. First, Dishon Dungey, and secondly, the man who this entry on the iceberg is about, David Colon. An unfortunate name for an even more unfortunate man. David would declare his martial arts background as Jubox Fu. It was his own creation, a martial art that he had come up with on his own and had been developing for years. This night was his opportunity to prove to everyone that this wasn't just some fickle fantasy. No, Jubox Fu was a credible threat in the space, and he was more than willing to put his brain matter on the line for it. As you can see, as the fight started, David Colon would, well, put his colon on his opponent in a weird technique to say the least, but it would prove to be absolutely ineffective. At just 1 minute into the first round, David Colon's Jubox Fu would succumb to the might of a real martial art, and he would be finished via strikes. David has yet to fight in professional martial arts since this most unfortunate bout. Some say that he now resides in the Appalachia's wilderness, there honing his mind, spirit and body, all in an effort for his inevitable comeback to this glorious world of martial arts, and to put on display the true power of Jubox Fu, something that I guess we will never really get to see. A shame really. Let's leave it to our own imaginations what Jubox Fu might actually look like practically. Meat stick defense. Does anyone actually know what this is? I can't find anything on the internet anywhere. And that's the same with Krabudu. I can only discern that it involves crustaceans of some kind.
Let's get on to the lobsters.
Women's self-defense. Women's self-defense has become big business, and whilst it's great that women everywhere are taking additional measures to protect themselves, there is concern that the emphasis has shifted away from a realistic and effective approach to women's self-defense to one that focuses on gimmicks and marketing. Women's self-defense has become an industry that is predicated on taking advantage of women by convincing them that other, more traditional martial arts are ineffective for women. Specifically, this industry now focuses a lot on empowering females against men. And let's face it, whilst men do shape up to be a physical threat to women, creating almost Bushido techniques to fend off men is equally as dangerous. Empowering women into thinking that one of these stupid techniques is useful is going to most certainly lead to some messed up situations. Lots of martial art gyms around the world now focus on bringing women onto the real mats by hosting women-only sessions, so that instead of ending up in some creep's gym who teaches them to kick guys in the nuts, they can actually learn how to throw a punch, take someone down, or submit someone. Techniques that are actually useful and empowering in violent situations. Tae Bo. William Wayne Blanks, born in 1955, is an American actor, martial artist, and fitness personality. Amongst many of his great achievements, perhaps his greatest was becoming a nationally ranked competitor in semi-contact and point karate during the 1980s. At his pinnacle, he would win a bronze medal at the 1981 World Games. After this, he would develop a new type of fitness group workout called Tae Bo. It's a hybrid fitness program that combines elements of martial arts and cardiovascular exercise. It emerged as a revolutionary workout in the 1990s, but Tae Bo became more than just a fitness fad. It was a cultural phenomenon that reshaped the fitness industry and brought a new level of intensity and fun to group exercise. The origins of Tae Bo could be traced back to the mid-1970s, when Billy Blanks sought to create a workout routine that was both engaging and effective at working out all body parts and muscles. Blanks, who had trained in boxing, began experimenting with combining the powerful strikes and dynamic movements of martial arts with the rhythmic intensity of aerobic exercises. You know, the ones that I'm talking about. Those corny group videos of everyone in brightly coloured lycra. Well, now imagine that mixed with martial arts. Well, the result is Tae Bo. This with over-the-top, enthusiastic workout music that incorporated punches, kicks, stances, and dance-like movements to deliver a true full-body cardio and muscular workout. Blank's motivation for creating Tae Bo was deeply personal. As a child, he had struggled with learning disabilities and physical challenges.
You know, I started off as a kid who had a learning disorder.
And martial arts had provided him with a sense of discipline, confidence, and purpose. He wanted to share these benefits with a broader audience, and he believed that by combining martial arts with fitness, he could create a workout that was not only physically transformative, but also mentally empowering. Tae Bo quickly gained popularity in the 1980s and 1990s, particularly as Blanks began teaching classes out of his fitness studio in Los Angeles. However, it was the advent of home workout videos that truly catapulted Blanks' creation into the mainstream. You can see examples of these workouts on screen now. Blanks would ultimately sell an estimated 1.5 million sets of his unique creation. Tae Bo quickly became a household name, and its popularity spread globally. Gyms began offering Tae Bo inspired classes, and the workout was featured in magazines, television shows, and even parodied in popular culture.
Imagine fighting some guy doing Tae Bo. Like, bring it on, dude. Come on.
Tae Bo's appeal lay in its accessibility. Anyone could participate regardless of their martial arts experience, and its promise of quick, visible results. He practically catapulted this industry into the stratosphere, and more than likely, your mum or your grandmum will know exactly who this man was. He was responsible for getting many young men and women interested in all different kinds of martial arts, and the legend goes that maybe he helped people land a punch when it mattered most in a street fight, because unwittingly, all those stay-at-home mums and beta males that had been watching this TV box sets had been training for the most important moment of their lives on the street. Tae Bo is not only a fitness program, it was an operation to create thousands of pugilists worldwide. Did it work? Probably not, but loads of people got shredded in the process. Blanks' legacy is that he managed to combine two very empowering elements of fitness and physical strength in an effective and entertaining program, getting people excited about working out and learning elements of different martial arts. What more can you ask for from a man? And I just realized that my Word document auto-corrected Billy Blank's name to Billy Bank, so I apologize for saying Banks a couple of times there. Spinjitzu. I want to take you back to some ancient academic lore, some bits of lost history, and that is relevant to Spinjitzu, I promise. It was the winter of 2006. Little old academic had just turned 10 years old, and as usually requested by his grandparents, he had cut out pictures from that year's Argos catalogue, items that he really wanted for Christmas. At the top of the page, encircled in red, was the new LEGO X-Wing set. It was my dream to have that set, and wouldn't you know it, on that cold Christmas morning that I woke up and excitedly ran down to the Christmas tree, I shook every box until I heard that not-so-subtle rattle of LEGO to reveal my 10-year-old mind's greatest desire. I didn't even touch any other presents. I just started smashing it together piece by piece. It was the greatest thing I had ever been bought, and I am sure you as the audience members have some similar experiences like this. Maybe it was Warhammer, maybe Lego as well, Nintendo, an Xbox, whatever it is. There's just something so wonderful about being an innocent kid and wanting and caring for nothing more than a goddamn box of plastic, something now that I'm an adult I couldn't even give a shit about. Well, let me tell you about Spinjitzu, this ancient form of martial arts that has only been used by the masters of Spinjitzu, otherwise known as the ninjas of Ninjago. They are a group of young warriors formed by Master Wu to protect the land of Ninjago from evil. Since the team's formation, they have fought many great enemies, from Lord Gamadan and the Skullkin, Pythor and the Serpentine, and even the Great Devourer. They are Cole, Kai, Jay, and Zane, and they are the masters of Spinjitzu. There have been many different variations of Spinjitzu and their attack forms, these big tornadoes of vicious, brutal power. No one truly knows which one is more powerful than the other, so much so that it has been heavily discussed in places like Reddit. Have a look at this post from DeRealBlock Gamer, for example, and if you think that this isn't important, then you are surely mistaken. Kids' fascination with Ninjago and subsequently downing E numbers and then spinning and smashing into each other violently in the street, back garden or playground is most definitely a catalyst to bring these children later in life into the actual dojo, because that kid that had fallen in love with a fucking X-Wing all those years ago was given an object that would allow me to imagine and roleplay and create stories with my toys. That very thing, as stupid as it sounds, allowed me to become a storyteller on YouTube later in life. So those spinning tiny meat sacks in the playground are potentially future champs of martial arts. Thanks Ninjago, and thank you Spinjitzu. Slapperera. From Stockton slaps to New Year's Eve clubhouse smackaroos against your wife, and also that time Michael Piera slapped that Russian dude. The good old Slapperera. From what I have gathered from my extensive and exhaustive research trying to figure out what the hell Slapperera genuinely is, I think it is just a term to describe the act of being a bit zesty and a bit showboaty with your slaps. And so I'm just going to take this opportunity to put slap fighting in here as a martial arts as well. I got nothing good to say about the sport. Despite what Dana White will have you want to believe about it being the most viral thing in the entire world, I still don't think that it makes it a viable sport. Slap fighting, despite my own opinion, has proved to be profitable. I will say that. And whilst I can't tell whether it's because when people get shown a clip of it, they just can't look away due to the stupid spectacle of it all, or if people just are genuinely interested in the deep and technical sport of slapping. And so I always found it really funny when in that Ultimate Fighter reality TV show spin-off version with slap fighting, where they would show the guys training to make their slap better. It was just hilarious watching these guys literally slap pads. I mean, I'm sure that it does make you a better slapper, but it just looks so funny. Anyway, the rules of slap fighting are fairly simple. The first slapper to go is the man that wins a coin toss. And let me tell you, the guy who goes first often wins because, well, the other guy has to take an unprotected shot to the head. Anyway, the other rules are there are 3 rounds in which each fighter will take 1 slap at each other. That slap is specifically an open palmed strike. The striker at the start of the round has 30 seconds to measure and hit his opponent. After the opponent is slapped, he has 30 seconds to recover. Each fighter has to stay in their box zone. The defender has to stand square on and chin up and both hands behind his back. The striker has to tell the ref which hand he is going to deliver the hit with and how many warm-ups they are going to use. Fighters win via decision or knockout. Simple really. The sport initially found its market in East Europe, but has spread all over the world, and now most famously Power Slap, which has attempted to create divisions and champions. I don't watch it, so who cares? Energy Bubble. Ah yes, perhaps the pinnacle of Bushido itself. The humble energy masters, men and women of Chi. There are those who harness the power of something beyond this material realm by fending off opponents using energy streams, energy bubbles, or energy force fields, channeling all their mighty Chi to create an invisible shield that deflects any and all attacks. The fact is, there is no bigger charlatans than those who claim they control Chi or energy. Those who get sucked into this pantomime, somehow convinced by their delusional masters, are strung along and perhaps go with the show simply out of the fact that they don't want to be embarrassed by everyone else going along with it. Then perhaps there are the most scary practitioners of energy, the no-touch masters, the true final boss of any video game. Perhaps the most famous example that you might have heard of for these no-touch death givers is that of George Dillman, a man who had once started out as a well-respected black belt of karate, a man who was so great in his field that he had even trained Muhammad Ali in the sport of karate once. He was perhaps most famously exposed by National Geographic TV show from the mid-2000s. It's a video that you have more than likely seen before. In the best part of the show, after a lot of shit talking from Dillman, the presenter of the show was placed on the mats in a very dangerous situation. He beckoned on the students of Dillman to give him a no-touch knockout, something, if to be believed, could inadvertently cause death using energies of the universe, and it went exactly how you imagined it would. The presenter is alive and well. Dillman, a man who knew his entire system, which had been making him a lot of money, was a farce, opted out of attempting to knock out the presenter, with a poor excuse that he was too sick to conduct the knockout. Even stranger still, when everyone was unable to knock out the presenter, Dillman gave the stupidest reason as to why it might not have happened.
But if the guy had his tongue in the wrong position of the mouth, that can also nullify it.
Even with this obvious scam being exposed by National Geographic, and exposed more widely by simple common sense, there are still those out there bewitched by the siren song of fake bullshido gurus, promising unlimited power in the palm of your hand. If anything, Energy and Chi has provided us with the very best memes of this generation, and for that, it has earned its place on this list. Smelling so bad your opponent won't come near. Whilst this may seem like a massive joke at first, smelling bad isn't actually that bad of a technique when used in conjunction with other martial arts on this list, and whilst it may be considered an art within itself, mastery of it has rarely ever been seen in modern times. Considering that this is an MMA and UFC focused channel, I would like to provide you with some people who have actually stank in order to distract their opponents. Forrest Griffin and Matt Lindland were always quite well known for being stinky boys, and Royce Gracie would famously allow his gi to go all mildewy before competitions. In order to combat people like this, BJJ competitions now immediately disqualify any practitioner that stinks, and people like OG ref Big John McCarthy would actively make MMA fighters shower before a fight, which, thank God. But if you think about it, smelling bad might actually be quite annoying and distracting for a professional athlete, so I kind of get why I might end up on this list, but let's face it, it's probably just a joke. Speaking of jokes, fighting for the streets, I mean, this is literally a meme. Sticking with the pointy end.
She left the wolf out there to warn of intruders and closed the door. By then, John had pulled off the rags he had wrapped it in. He held it out to her. Arya's eyes went wide, dark eyes like his. A sword, she said in a small hushed breath. The scabbard was soft grey leather, supple as skin. John drew out the blade slowly, so he could see the deep blue sheen of the steel. This is no toy, he told her. Be careful you don't cut yourself. The edges are sharp enough to shave with. Girls don't shave, Arya said. Maybe they should. Have you ever seen the Scepter's legs? She giggled at him. It's so skinny. So are you, John told her. I had Mikken make this special. The Bravos use sword like this in Pentos and Mir, and the other 3 cities. It won't hack a man's head off, but it can poke him full of holes if you're fast enough. I can be fast, Arya said. You'll have to work at it every day. He put the sword in her hands, showed her how to hold it and stepped back. How does it feel? Do you like the balance? I think so, Arya said. First lesson, John said. Stick 'em with the pointy end.
This entry comes from the Song of Ice and Fire book series. The passage I have just read is from the first book in the series called A Game of Thrones, released in August of 1996. In that scene, Jon Snow, a bastard of Eddard Stark of Winterfell, gives his true-born sister a sharp and pointy blade, crafted from the weapons used in the 3 cities of Bravos, a place beyond the Stepstones, off the eastern shores of Westeros. His first lesson, as discussed, is to stick people with the pointy end. You have probably seen the TV show, so it doesn't bear talking about too much. I believe this entry is more so of a meme than anything, but does have a point. If all else fails, why not just stick him with the pointy end of a blade, just getting shredded in swole?
How much you weigh?
About 260 right now.
260. You're a big dude, shredded too, all bodied up. Like,
yeah.
Did you say you weigh 260?
260.
And people think that like muscles like mean something. Muscles don't mean nothing.
Think you beat me in a street fight?
You in a street fight?
Yeah.
You're a podcaster, brother.
I think I might be able to get you.
Yeah. Yeah, well.
I'm athletic as fuck.
No,
I'll jump on you.
No.
There is something to be said for a man who can pump iron and get massive, whilst perhaps intimidating to a layman who, in complete fear of the girthy, roided out wall of muscle forming on his position, might cower and run. It is instead nothing to a skinny guy like Ryan Hall, who might tie him into a pretzel and spit him out the other side. But at a certain point, and at certain circumstances, size does matter, And when that size is carefully perfected muscle generated in a room of iron and testosterone, it becomes even more important when considering its utility in combat. And so whilst Bradley Martin, who's clearly just playing on the meme at this point, says he is 260, to a certain degree, there is some credibility to what he is saying. He could more than likely pin down and kill half of all Americans, even if they were trained in some kind of martial arts. Add on to that some kind of fundamental in wrestling or BJJ or striking, then a man who is shredded and swole might truly be a credible threat. In a large open space, however, their steroid-infused cardiovascular system will more than likely fail them. If you are interested in the ancient and expansive art of getting shredded and swole, here are some deep lore on how to do it. Eat in a calorie deficit, do resistance training, be consistent. Oh, and steroids. Lots and lots of steroids. Good luck on your swole journey. And just like my wife always said, I end pretty weak. I want to say a massive thank you for going through this list with me. Between my more serious content like the documentaries, it's always a blast for me to be able to take on these really long, less intense projects, because it gives me time to just kind of sit around and write and not focus on making a coherent script or do incredible editing. I can just kick it back and have a laugh. Plus I love the challenge of being able to make super long videos. I look forward to rounding off the year with another video or two, and I'll see you all there.